Welcome, everyone. This is Michael Gibbs. I'm joined by Mark Milovanovic, and we are going to run our free CCSP training, which is the Certified Cloud Security Professional Bootcamp. We are really excited to do this. We are going to be here for about 10 days, and we're going to have a whole lot of fun in this free training. And this free training is designed to prepare you for the CCSP certification. This CCSP certification is from the ISC2. It is a wonderful cloud security certification. And before we begin, Mark and I will talk a little bit about why we actually chose this. And we hope you have an incredible time and learn a lot. Before we begin, it looks like we've got some people from all over the world. I absolutely love this. So maybe we'll acknowledge that. I see some people that are in Qatar. I haven't been there in a little while, but I've spent some time there as well. Lovely place. I see there's somebody named Teddy over here, or I have a feeling it's Theodoros. So Theodoros, are you in the U.S. or are you in Greece, perchance? Which is where my family's from. Let's see where I've got some other people that are actually over here from all over. So anyway, welcome everyone. We're going to begin soon. So my name is Mike Gibbs. I'm the CEO of Go Cloud Careers. I've been in tech now for, a lot longer than I actually want to admit. Ever since I left practicing internal medicine when I was a nurse practitioner in my youth, I've been in tech. I'm one of the first Cisco certified internet experts. I took the CISSP exam over 20 years ago when I first took it and passed it. So it's been a long time for me in this cloud computing world, network security world, networking world, enterprise architecture world. And I'm joined here by Mark Milovanovic, who is also a Cisco certified internet expert. He is our chief technology officer. If we need to get techie or geeky, it's going to be Mark. It's going to be the one that we're going to be diving deep. Yes, I've been in this world for a while, but it'll be Mark that gets real deep for us. And we're really lucky to have him here. So we're going to be doing this. Now, Mark and I, let's talk for about 2 or 3 minutes why we decided to teach this course and why we chose this one over another one. So I'll kick it off, but I want to let you all know why we're doing this CCSP. Because we do a lot of free certification training. And on our channel, if you're looking for it, you can find a completely free AWS Solutions Architect Bootcamp, and AWS Advanced Networking Bootcamp, an Azure Solutions Architect Expert Bootcamp you'll find completely free on our channel, a Cisco Certified Network Associate Bootcamp, and now it's us and our time for security. So as it turned out, Mark and I had finished creating the CISSP course for all of our students in our Cloud Architect, Enterprise Architect, and Architecture programs as part of our standard training. And when we were done that, Mark and I said, let's come up with a free cybersecurity certification that we can give away completely for free on the internet. And honestly, Mark and I actually created a complete AWS Security Advanced training session. And then when Mark and I actually looked at it, we actually decided not to give it away and not to do it. And actually, Mark was one of the reasons behind that. And here was the reason. The reason is, as we analyze what people actually need to know in cybersecurity, there was very little in that in the AWS course. And the AWS course was great at teaching you the names of AWS things and configuring how to configure AWS things. But the reality is that 98% of the world is multi-cloud. And in a hybrid multi-cloud world, which is reality, none of those things that were being taught in there would fit into a traditional multi-cloud architecture. And with that, its utility, while it's great for an all AWS solution, doesn't fit the real world of enterprise computing. So Mark was the first person to say that. Plus, Mark wanted to talk. I'll let you talk about the depth piece because you really wanted me to get more cybersecurity. Maybe you could talk about that quickly. And then I want to tell you about a few things that we have for free that are going to make this experience even better for you.
Exactly. So I recall when you when we started working on it, you eventually sent me your version over. I reviewed it, and I thought for what it was, meaning it was tailored towards Amazon's web services and how to implement security based on that type of cloud service provider platform. I think it was great for what it was there. But like with a lot of certification training, I noticed that the foundations were really lacking. And I don't mean the foundations in regards to, okay, you need encryption, you need some kind of infrastructure, like a public key infrastructure with digital certificates and so forth to make all that, funky stuff work. But it was more in regards to where's the rest of the security field? So we like to build up training so that people that have little to no experience can come into it and then learn the foundations so that they can then eventually go and tackle more of the intermediate to the advanced
Yes.
kind of topics. And when it's very specific to a vendor platform, they leave a lot of the other stuff out. And that's why I remember telling you at first, it says, I like for what it is, but I'll be honest, where's the value for that? Like, truly, where's the value for the people that want to be security architects with this? And I know we were joking over, saw the clickety clack, right? With the web GUI and so forth. So we decided on, let's look at something that, number one, is going to have more of a holistic approach when it comes to both security and kind of tie the cloud into it. And then the other portion was something that can give people a financial incentive of want to pursue it. We discussed last week in regards to why security is so important. And then without going down the rabbit hole in regards to the perimeter being removed and how different architectures come into play, both the defensible architecture as well as the zero trust architecture, the turtle shell, and so forth, we looked at something that can give you an income boost. And let's be honest, AWS plus security, great. Not the type of income boost that is worth your time. And I mean that not disparaging to AWS, but in the marketplace, because the marketplace will dictate what the training and the skills that you garner are going to pay you. And guess what? The CCSP was one of them where, on average, we're talking six-figure income. So it was a no-brainer between a vendor agnostic approach, vendor neutral approach compared to a vendor approach. So, and that's why we sat down, we decided it'd be better to give students and as well as those that are right now joining us from all over the world, because cloud is everywhere, right? You hear this term ubiquitous, something that they can actually take with them and make an actual difference in their career. And I think that's why this training, we are so proud of it. We're excited to give it to everybody. We look forward to what type of questions everybody's going to bring about. And I don't know what else to say besides I hope everybody has fun as well.
Okay, so now for the housekeeping. First thing I want to tell you about is, because this is a very substantial exam and it's going to be meaningful for your career, but it's substantial, our team wrote a book for you to assist you with this entire program. And it will cover every component of the exam. It is based upon the training materials that we made for you. So Chris will be providing a link to the completely free certified cloud security professional boot security certification exam guide that my team wrote for you. It is all free, so make sure you download it to go with this career. It's a big exam, so you're going to need to be, what do you call it? You're going to need to study a little more, so we've got you that free book. And this book is going to follow the exact order that we're going to teach the boot camp. So you want to use this book, you want to take notes on the book as you go through. We wanted to give you something meaty and substantial because this is a meaty and substantial cybersecurity exam. And it's all free. Also wanted to let you know that we will be having a webinar like we do on every Thursday on how to become an architect of any kind. And we'll go over what we do as architects versus people think about what we do as architects. And then we'll actually go over the roles, and we'll spend upwards of 60 to 90 minutes answering any questions you may have about your career on Zoom. And that way we can do what we can to help you. And it's all free. We do one every week. So I wanted to tell you about that. And otherwise, we're going to get started. Now, just to let you know, because this is a cloud security exam, we are going to talk about the cloud a fair amount throughout this program. In fact, we're going to start on it. So if you know cloud computing, great. We may present it to you a different way. I promise you we probably will, since I've been designing clouds and building clouds for the last few decades and working with various forms of cloud computing since 1996. Prior to it even being called cloud computing, ISDN clouds, frame relay clouds, ATM clouds, BGP clouds, lots and lots and lots of clouds. So we're going to go over that. And then we'll probably talk about some of the business rationale for security, because if you can't get the business rationale in for cybersecurity, you're likely or guaranteed to break the business or not be able to convince the business that they actually need the cybersecurity systems that you need. And so we'll go over that, and then we'll get into everything. And then once we start hitting data, I got to tell you, it's going to get pretty geeky pretty fast. The way the discussions will go is we will speak for approximately 20 minutes or so. And when I say 20 minutes, sometimes it'll be 15 minutes, sometimes it'll be 30 minutes based upon the content we're covering. And then Mark and I will answer any questions you may have about the content for about 10 minutes. And that way we'll teach, we'll answer questions, we'll teach, we'll answer questions, because I want it to be a real learning experience for you. And if you get stuck, you're not going to be learning. So we want to help you along the way. So I hope that begins. We're going to start going with the boot camp right now. So do me a favor. Let me know where you're at. I see some Ghana. I see Nigeria. I see people in West Palm Beach area right by me. I see Scotland. I see Argentina. I see Bahrain. Oh, that's beautiful. I haven't been there in a little while. I see London, the place I practically worked almost every week. I see more Nigeria. I see Calgary. I've spent some time in Calgary, Banff, and Edmonton, for those of you that I see those things. I haven't been to Perth in a long time. And actually, I don't think I've made it to Surrey. Wait, I have, but not many times. Zurich is, I've been there. I've also been freezing there in the wintertime, or at least it's freezing for a Florida person, and Kenya. So Sydney, spent lots of time there. Augusta. My wife, Barnes, is actually in Philadelphia right now with our family. And I see Phoenix, Arizona, Virginia, San Diego, Glasgow, Scotland. Nice place there. And Trinidad. Oh, boy. I haven't been to Port of Spain in a little while. So I absolutely love this. So I see we have such a diverse group. So we will begin. So we're going to begin with...
Yes. Let me just put it on audio so everybody knows, because I've seen a couple of questions come in. The free study guide that was provided, which, by the way, is going to save you a few $100s when it comes to not having to purchase additional reference material. Our team is going to periodically add that into the chat for everybody. And then eventually we'll also have it in the description box. So just in case that everybody knows. Additionally, a couple of questions came in where people were asking, will this be recorded? Once the session concludes, YouTube will nicely do its encoding, put it up on YouTube Live, and then you'll be able to come back to the channel as well and review it from that perspective. And additionally, when you do sign up, because you'll have to go through a little sign-up process to get the actual study guide, give it a couple of minutes so that eventually you get the notification via email, and that way you'll be able to download your free study guide.
Yeah, so what's going to happen is you'll enter a form, and I don't know where Chris from my team set up the redirect. After the form goes through, it'll either take you to our YouTube channel or website, not 100% sure, and then you'll get an email. Because of the mass number of emails we're going to get on an event like this, the servers are basically programmed to stagger the emails over a course of, say, 15-minute period. Because if we send 1,000 emails to somebody's domain at the same time, they'll get marked as spam. So all servers and mass mails have to do this. So that's why it's going to take about 15 minutes.
Correct. So just give it a little bit.
And you're going to get an email that will show the download, but it's going to take about 15 minutes. All right, so let's get into the content. So we're going to begin with, what is cloud computing? And I know there's a lot of fluffy definitions of what is cloud computing on the internet, but we're going to be very clear. Cloud computing is renting space in someone else's data center. So traditionally, and by traditionally, I mean for the last 30 years or so, I've been in the world of designing systems for companies. And basically what we do is we create these giant rooms that have two power companies coming in. They have generators and backup generators in case the power goes out. They have batteries. They have massive air conditioners and more than one air conditioner. And we have all of our key data center components. So the routers that actually direct the traffic through the network, the switches where the servers plug themselves in, for example, the storage area networks that are plugged in, etc. So the reality is this. If I were to build a data center and put cloud computing software on it, it would be called a private cloud. The cloud providers build giant data centers and they rent you space in these data centers. And for the most part, you get a virtual private data center, which you might call your virtual private cloud or your VNet, depending upon the cloud provider. So it is just renting space in someone else's data center. And that's the most critical and misunderstood thing. So everything we have in a data center, we have a firewall in the data center. It is a hardware device. When we go to the cloud provider, we get a virtual firewall, which sits on a virtual machine. In the data center, we have a server, a physical server with a hypervisor on it, and we have virtual machines. They're called virtual machines. In the AWS, those same virtual machines are called EC2 instances. On Google, they're called Compute Engine instances. Azure calls them virtual machines. It's the identical topic. The block areas, the storage area networks, block storage that we've been using for the last 25 years, guess what? is the same block storage we use in the cloud. So understand the cloud is renting space in someone else's data center, regardless of the titles that it's called. The next thing when it comes to cloud computing is the cloud providers themselves have big network connections. And what do I mean by that? The cloud providers have connections to all internet service providers for the most part, all wide area network providers. And as such, you can actually reach the cloud providers directly through the internet. That's another characteristic of cloud computing. But if you really want to manage your system securely over the internet, you're either going to need a private line going to the cloud provider, you're going to need some form of encrypted tunnel, ideally IPsec, although you can also encrypt it through, say, TLS, SSL type encryption. But that's what you're talking about. Data center that you can access remotely. Cloud computing by itself, and this probably would show up on an exam, they want you to understand that it is self-service, that customers themselves of the cloud providers can basically rent what they want in an on-demand environment. And the key of cloud computing is it tends to be agile, scale out, scale in with minimal friction. And that's what we're talking about. And that means, when we need them, for example, let's say I'm a routing hardware vendor and I want to test 1,000 virtual firewalls or 1,000 as if 1,000 users are going into a firewall. I can have someone on my team write an infrastructure as code script, like a Terraform script, launch 1,000 virtual routers sitting on virtual machines, launch another few thousand virtual machines, and QA test those routers. So it comes up quick, we can shut it down quick, and for the most part, we pay for what we use. So there's that. Now, cloud computing is generally much more expensive than traditional computing in reality. David Lithicum's numbers, and he's probably the best person to ask because he was Deloitte's chief of cloud strategy, and his numbers are pretty good, is that on average, cloud computing costs 250% of what it costs in the actual data center. Those numbers are in line with what I've typically seen. Here's the key benefit of the cloud provider. If I want to order a server from my data center, I may have to order that server. It may take 4 weeks to get to me. When it finally gets to me, I may have to have somebody rack it, stack it, put it on the rack, install the hypervisors and the operating system. By the time I'm done, it can take me 6 weeks to the time I'm in a data center, I can launch additional capacity. In the cloud, we can launch thousands of virtual machines in seconds. So the real ability of the cloud is the ability for it to help businesses take an idea and turn it into an actual product or service quickly. So things that would take weeks or months now take seconds. And that's the true benefit of the cloud. It's the agility, and that provides substantial business value. Things you should think about with cloud computing: it is a shared resource. So throughout this, we're going to talk about the security implications of this. In the traditional data center, if I have 10,000 servers, they are mine and there's no other customers here. In a cloud provider's data center, guess what you're going to have? Thousands, if not tens of thousands of customers in the same thing. Kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So you are pooled with other resources, which enables the cloud providers to buy something with a discount and an economy of scale, and it enables them to resell it to various people. Unfortunately, the economy of scale typically doesn't benefit the customer in terms of cost, because while the cloud providers do get a substantial economy of scale and discount buying the equipment, they are so big and so hyperscale that they typically need a lot of critical procedures to be able to manage any of that equipment. And the extra governance and structure these large businesses need tend to make them to be slower and cost more. That's why a small business is much more nimble than a big business. Now, one thing is for sure with cloud computing, we take a capital expense, and I'll explain what that actually is, and we'll turn it into an operational expense. Now, this could be a great thing, or it could be a horrible thing. And in order to be able to provide your customer guidance, you have to understand their capital structure. What does capital cost them? For example, what is their weighted average cost of capital? What is the amount of capital they have on hand? What is their credit rating? And with that information, as a cloud security architect or a security architect, you can advise your client based on the cost of financing or leasing the technology in a build it versus a rent it or lease it in the cloud. But it changes the cost structure from CapEx to OpEx. Sometimes that's a very good thing. From a tax perspective, an operational expense is better than depreciation, typically speaking in the US, which may benefit someone, but potentially not, again, based upon that organization's revenue, EBITDA, net income, that kind of thing. But it enables businesses to add capacity without buying it ahead of time or financing it. So think about that. Now, one of the great things about the cloud computing that's going to be covered in this exam is your ability to grow the footprint or shrink it. And that really is essential. And the other key is the ability to just launch everything with a script. So the reality in real cloud computing, cloud engineers that are out there, they're not going to be using those little management consoles, click, click, click on a box for the most part. Somebody's going to write an infrastructure as code strip and launch something immediately. For example, in a disaster recovery environment, if we lose something in an AWS cloud and we had our data backed up to the Azure cloud, we could launch one Terraform script and basically launch the infrastructure in minutes. So think about that. So scaling in the cloud is based upon code. The code is less labor intensive. Much of this code can even be written by AI. So think about that from an operations perspective from the business. Typically speaking, the cloud's key benefit is something called auto scaling. And we can do this in a private data center, assuming we have capacity, but in the cloud, we need the capacity. Auto scaling is the ability for a system that's under load to add capacity on demand. So when we talk about cloud computing and why, let me give you an example of a global retailer. And here's the way we build systems in the data center. If I have to build a global retailer's environment, what I have to design for and build for is peak capacity. So what would happen for that global retailer on the busiest day of the year? It's typically, at least in the US, it's called Black Friday. It's the day after Thanksgiving. That's going to be the biggest demand on that global retailer servers. So in my data center, if I need 1,000 web servers to be able to support that, I have to buy 1,000 web servers and run those web servers at all time. In the cloud, maybe my average capacity and need is 100 web servers, but I need 1,000 servers during that Christmas rush, that holiday season for that retailer. In the cloud, I can run 100 servers all year long, and then add those extra 900 or more servers needed necessary for that big sale. That auto scaling, for the most part, is probably the biggest reason organizations actually use cloud computing. As we're discussing cloud computing, you have to understand that it is metered service, kind of like getting in a taxi. Sometimes your taxi ride can be pretty cheap, and sometimes if you get stuck along the way, it can get very expensive. When you are using cloud services, you pay for everything. Everything. And the example is if I were to buy a wire connection to a traditional wire connection, like a private line, and my private line costs $3,000 a month, I pay $3,000 a month for the private line. Typically speaking, when connecting for the cloud providers, you pay the same $3,000 for the private line. Then you pay a daily fee to have the private line, and then you actually pay to use the private line. And that can get much more expensive. So when cloud architects, cloud security architects, or anybody is actually analyzing or creating a system design and trying to build a business case or an ROI model, you have to calculate everything. So in a virtual machine in your data center, you get all your statistics, all your logging. In the cloud, you have to pay extra to get logs, or the kind of logs, and then you got to pay to store your logs. So there's a lot of things that add up in the cloud, data being transferred. So that's going to determine the effectiveness of whether cloud is cost effective or not. Typically speaking, for systems that run very little and are agile and expand in or out at all times, they're typically great for cloud computing. By comparison, systems that need high compute performance and run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, nonstop, they're typically substantially cheaper in the data center. So it's about knowing what to move and why. Now, when we're talking about cloud security, when we're talking about any security, and we're talking about IT, understand that IT, generally speaking, is not a revenue producing department. What do I mean by this? So if I'm a sales rep and I'm selling products, I'm bringing money into the company. I hope everybody understands that. If I work at Cisco and I'm an architect and I'm selling Cisco solutions and I sell a $1 billion solution, I just help bring in $1 billion to Cisco. To the client that bought the Cisco products, They're going to buy that infrastructure. They're going to make that investment in that infrastructure. And then they're going to be trying to figure out how to make money off of that infrastructure. Or perfectly, if they had a good architect, they'd figure out their business needs and figure out what they're trying to do in the business, and then buy the technology and make sure that technology makes money for that business. That's the way a real architect does things, that way. 70 to 80% of architectural projects and technology projects provide no value because they don't start from the business, they start from the tech. So we're going to have to talk about here, we have to get the business requirements. And why am I talking about this? So security solutions are expensive. And businesses don't make any money from security solutions. They don't make any money from their back-end software developers. They don't make any money for their back-end engineers. The sales reps bring in money. So IT is a cost department for most businesses, which means we are going to have to be real good at evaluating that organization's risk. And we're going to go through some calculations on how to do it at some point through this program. We're going to talk about quantifying the risk to that business, the risk of an information breach, the risk of downtime. I want to make sure that these are things you're thinking about ahead of time. What is the cost of a minute of downtime to that business, for example? What is the cost if information is compromised? The new secret formula for a new drug, for a drug company. What is the brand damage that's associated with a telecommunications provider having the records hacked for about 100 million Americans, for example, or a healthcare insurance provider that had the same thing? What are the quantitative costs of that? What are the qualitative costs in terms of brand damage? And we'll be talking a lot about that because this is a professional certification, and as such, it addresses a lot of professional issues and architectural issues. Key here is security has to be thought of as a critical business function, and it is up to the security team to carry themselves as those professionals and have that business acumen and leadership knowledge to be able to show the business what happens if they don't invest in the right security solutions, and be able to advise them when do they invest in infrastructure, when do they transfer their risk for an insurance provider. And we'll cover all these things throughout this program. We also have to be very mindful that the more security we add to the system, generally speaking, the harder we make everyone's lives. So in addition to determining, what we need to protect and how much we should spend to protect, we have to think about designing these security systems that have the minimal impact on the users while still providing the maximum amount of security we can. After we make all the trade-offs of how much can we hinder people for along the way? So we're going to get into a lot of concepts through these 2 weeks, but I want you to think about that ahead of time because these are critical issues. We must understand the business and the business's needs and the vision of the business and the business processes, because if we throw tech in that messes up a business process, you can see serious damage. And it can get real bad real fast. I'm not going to say there's a causality here, but in the US, we used to have paper records, for example, when we practiced healthcare. And here's the way it used to be. When I practiced internal medicine in the old days, I'd see my patient. I had 15-minute visits. I spent 12 minutes with the patient, 3 minutes writing a note on a piece of paper. U.S. government mandated electronic health records because they were trying to improve healthcare. And it made logical sense that if we had computer systems in there with data sharing, we'd make better business decisions, right? So they mandated it as a law. And you know what happened? We now had to spend 12 minutes entering information on the computer and 3 minutes with the patient. So I used to spend 12 minutes with the patient. Now I can spend 3 minutes with the patient. I used to spend 3 minutes documenting. Now I need about 12 minutes documenting. Well, as it turns out, medical errors went from the 5th leading cause of death prior to computers to the 3rd leading cause of death after computers. Medical errors went up 250%. And 250,000 people now die each year from medical errors when it was only 98,000 before. So that's an example of putting technology in and having it hamper the system. There's no studies to show that causality, but around those times, that's what happened. That's what happened to the workflow of the provider. So kind of hope you want to think about it that way. So we have to understand the business at all impacts. Otherwise, we can do bad things by accident. So we need to understand the business processes, the operational business requirements. We need to understand cost of downtime, the maximum amount of downtime that business will be able to tolerate to be able to build business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans. We're going to have to get involved in safety and think about safety. So we're just kicking it off with the intro, and that's the kind of stuff we're going to be talking about. When it comes to business requirements, we're going to be talking about functional requirements. And these may be things like performance aspects necessary for accomplishing a business task. So, for example, how would a sales rep do their job to sell things? Non-functional requirements, as we on the concept of business requirements, are, for example, of aspects that we'd like to have or expected to have, but not 100% necessary to do our job. So, kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And Claudia, yes, I used to be in healthcare a long time ago. So let's talk a little bit about resource distribution. So another thing we're going to be thinking of as we're dealing with this is the reality is no organization for the most part, especially in enterprise, is just going to be in a single cloud provider. It's just not going to be that way. And it's not going to be like a cloud certification where you take an AWS certification and you think everything's AWS, or an Azure certification and you think it's all Azure. Here's the average enterprise: 2 to 3 clouds, 200 to 1,000 different applications, and potentially 100 to 1,000 technology vendors. So understand when we're dealing with security, this is what we're dealing with. And that's why we chose the much more sophisticated security certification to give you all for free. That's what we're actually talking about. So big, sophisticated environment. And we're going to have to pick the right kinds of technology. The right kinds of technology that'll be in our data center. Why? Because the data center is closest to us. And typically speaking, if it's in the same campus where our users are, it has the best performance and lowest latency. And we can also provide the highest degree of control and security there. But it's much more stagnant there than what we actually have in the cloud, which is these agile systems. So we've got a lot of things that we need to think about. Now, we may not just be in the cloud. In the data center, an organization may have information in what's called the colo provider. And what's a colo provider? That's a company that builds data centers, like a cloud provider. And in this case, they give you the ability to put your own equipment there. So organizations may have some colo providers. They may have some cloud providers. They're going to have data centers. They're going to have computing systems in every country in the world that you can think of. So start thinking about that. That's the big picture we're talking about. And we're going to have to look at various forms of cloud service delivery models in order to help our businesses and our clients choose the right thing. So when it comes to any architectural situation, the first thing we have to do is understand the existing state. And we'll talk about that throughout this program. What is the existing state? How does the world look today? So when you walk into an organization, how's the business working today? What are the key business processes they have today? What are that organization's secret sauce? What is it about that business, whether it be a proprietary business process or a secret formula or a patent, that enables that organization to be successful? If that organization has a lot of sales, how are they driving that sales? What are they doing? How does that business position itself in its market, in its segment market? Is it a luxury brand? Is it a regular brand? How do they reach their audience? Those kind of things. What kind of assets does that organization have? And what do we need to protect? And I've always, and in the concept of security, let's say I've got a formula for a brand new blockbuster drug that's going to sell $20 billion over the next 10-year patent. That's something I'm going to spend some money to protect. Now, I have this beautiful cat, Cindy. Maybe I'll get out a Cindy photo at some point during this week. Love my little cat, Cindy. But if I wanted to make a website of photos of my cat, Cindy, chances are I'm not going to spend as much money to protect that Cindy the cat website as I would that $20 billion drug, and no business would. So we have to focus on what we're protecting, what it's worth, why we're protecting it. And we're going to do some numbers at some point that are going to show us this. But our initial focus has to be on the business requirements. We have to understand the assets, the inventory, the processes. Then we have to evaluate what they have. So here's the way the process is going to flow. You're going to see this process flow potentially on this exam. Again, this is a professional exam. So here's how you get your business requirements. When possible, you interview the C-suite. the CEO, the CIO, the CTO, the CISO. And by doing so, you're going to find out their vision for the business. How else do we learn? Well, typically speaking, when I design any architecture, I walk around the business whenever possible. I look at what people are doing in their jobs. I ask questions. If I'm going to check their security, I might give them a fake name like Fred Flintstone or Barney Rubble and see if anybody were to actually notice it. That's not the name that's going to be on my ID. I ask goofy questions. So we're going to have to understand that. So what else do we do when we're trying to figure out what an organization has? Well, we're going to be looking at that organization's traffic. What's their network traffic look like? Do they have logs of their traffic? Do they have NetFlow logs on their routers? Do they have VPC flow logs, for example? Do they have logs from their IDS, IPS systems, the next generation firewalls were going on there? Where are their operating systems logs? Where are their SIEM systems? So all that kind of stuff is going to give us a lot of information. We'll inventory their assets, whatever they may be. That could be plant, property, equipment, secret formulas, that kind of things. So there is that. We're going to interview users. We're potentially going to look at an organization's financial records. We're going to look at that organization's security and insurance potentially. And here's the reason why. Let's say we look at an organization and we find out they've got a risk of some kind. Let's say the risk is $1 billion risk. If they can prevent that $1 billion risk for $100 million in cybersecurity, they're going to do it. But what if they could transfer that risk to somebody else? An insurance company. Maybe it costs less to do that. And part of what we do in cybersecurity is determine which risks need to be mitigated, which risk could be transferred to, say, an insurance company, which risk we can afford to mitigate. And we'll go through that throughout this training program at some point. But we might collect marketing data. We're also going to be connecting a lot about regulatory mandates, for example, because depending upon where we're at. So what we'll do is we're going to answer some questions for a few minutes. Hopefully there's not too many questions just now. And then after that, we will go into a business impact and analysis and some other really, really cool stuff. So, Chris, has it been 20 minutes? Because I kind of get the feeling it has been.
It has been.
Okay.
But I don't think we've got any questions quite yet.
Okay.
Yeah, most everything was about bootcamp times, the book,
Okay.
etc. We haven't had any questions about content, which is not to be surprising yet. You haven't gotten too deep yet.
Okay. Well, and if there's no other questions, I'm gonna nobody put any questions in the chat box. I'm gonna keep going for a few more minutes.
All right.
Okay. So now for you folks, we're gonna talk about a business impact analysis, and the business impact analysis is going to be something that's going to be absolutely critical for us to do as cybersecurity architects. And here's the reason why. We need to understand the business. We need to understand those business processes. We need to understand how that business operates. We need to understand the threats and the risk to the business. And we have to evaluate the likelihood of an impact to the business based upon every threat that actually exists. So we have to do this from a quantitative perspective and a qualitative perspective. So I'm going to do maybe potentially a little bit of MBA math throughout this kind of program. And it's the same kind of math that I had to do in my MBA, which is the same kind of math we typically have to do as architects from time to time. Or people that are involved in technology sales, or people technology involved in leadership positions in tech. So we have to evaluate each threat and the likelihood of each one. And then based upon this information, we have the quantitative information we need to be able to prioritize resources and where we put them, Do we put them in local resources? Do we need more insurance? Can we mitigate these risks? But we can't do any of that without knowing the business. So we're going to do two kinds of impact assessments: a quantitative impact assessment, and that's going to provide the financial impact to assist in decision making. We are going to also have to look at data to quantify these options. So what is the monetary value of that? We also have to do a qualitative impact. So qualitative is more soft, squishy stuff. So cloud provider gets hacked. What's the impact of that to less people that really want to go or trust that cloud provider? Or what's the impact to their brand? And let's face it, all cloud providers get hacked. I'm sure. I mean, some have been public about it. Some cloud providers have had a lot of outages with questionable reasons behind it. But every system in technology at some point could be hacked. And but what is the impact of that? What is the impact of the crowd on CrowdStrike to their brand? Are they as trusted after they push the bad update to users' computers? And why should those users' computers allow that update without testing it in the first place? So, there's two sides of the equation, but what's the impact of the business? And we will talk much more about that. We have to prioritize. I want to make it very clear. There is not an unlimited number of resources in a business. They won't be able to mitigate every single risk, both from a financial perspective and if they tried really hard to mitigate all risks, you know what would ultimately happen? They would make security so challenging. And we need to think about the impact we have on people. I can recall setting up a system for a high security bank many, many years ago, about 20 years ago. And the bank said to me, we need some impossible to crack password policy. And they were going to enforce it. So what they did is they had like these 15-character passwords. And what you had is people would have to log into 20 different systems, and they had 20 sticky notes on their desktop, which actually had their passwords directly on their desktops. Now, if you think about that, it's ridiculous, but that's because it was the only way people could get through the ridiculous security that was there. They ultimately moved to a much better security system right after that, but you get the concept. So that's what we're kind of talking about. We will have to prioritize. We can't do it all. So now we have to talk about certain things. So quantitative. The next thing we need to think about is the maximum amount of downtime a business can tolerate. What does this mean? So if we look at an organization's cost of downtime, we have to be able to understand what could happen to some businesses should they cease to function. So, for example, if there was a massive earthquake that took down an organization's technology, and the people actually needed that technology to be able to do their jobs, what if an organization had 100,000 people whose average salary was $50 an hour, fully loaded, and those 100,000 people couldn't work for a period of 8 hours? Now, the company's paying that. Now, in addition to those losses, what if the business needed to sell during those hours? And we have some businesses that sell $1 million a minute. And what if that business was down for 8 hours? Can the business tolerate those degree of financial losses? So we have to know that, which is basically, a lot of that has to do with how much reserve cash that organization has, how critical the sales are to their operations. Or what if it's a hospital and they can tolerate their systems being down for 30 minutes, but after that, people are going to start dying. And when people start dying, not only are there people that died, but there's lawsuits, there's brand damage, what have you. So I want you to consider all of that. So what we need to know is the maximum amount of downtime an organization could tolerate. Why do we need to know that? Because if the maximum tolerable downtime is 4 hours before the business has irreparable damage, and that's what you consider maximum tolerable downtime, then obviously we need to put a protection system in place that business will not be down for 4 hours. Hope that makes sense. The maximum tolerable downtime to the business drives the RTO, or the when we have to return to operations. So that's why we need to always understand the business and business operations. So if we know how much downtime the business can tolerate, now we can think of the recovery time objective for each business function. Now, there are some business functions that don't have to happen. Maybe the marketing department, for example, doesn't have to create a new brand message for a month, and the company could still survive. But parts of that business are essential. For example, if a hospital can't bill for 3 days, it might survive it. But if it can't see patients and do surgeries and do everything that's necessary to save lives, that would be a problem. So the recovery time objective is less than the maximum tolerable downtimes. And that's why we have to start from the business first. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Now that brings us to the recovery point objective. The recovery point objective is the maximum acceptable amount of data that a business can lose. So what does this mean? Let's say we have a bank that does 1 million transactions an hour. And each one of those transactions in that bank could be $10 to the bank. Well, that'd be $10 million an hour of data loss that they would have. And they may not want to do that. They might be willing to spend an extra $3 million or $4 million to prevent that $10 million an hour loss. And that would affect the way they back up their data and the strategy behind the backup of the data. So I kind of hope this helps. So the recovery point objective is the maximum amount of data loss. And it's going to specify at what point in time a business can recover its data. Can the business tolerate 5 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 10 hours, or 10 days? It's all based upon the business. And that's why in architecture, we can't have a preferred technology. We can't have a preferred approach. Architecture is like medicine, where we have to get all the facts, pass it through our knowledge base, create a diagnosis, and create some form of plan that's going to help that business. And that's why we can't have a bias. So let's talk about identifying certain risks in a business impact analysis. We have to identify what risks actually exist for that business. So, for example, let's say you're here in South Florida like I am. Some of the risks might be severe storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, but not blizzards. Lightning strikes. Yeah. But other things could be like a pandemic or a mudslide or an avalanche or an earthquake. And different businesses, based upon where they're at, face different risks. But that's some of the risks that we would have to prepare for. What else? Terrorist attacks, wars, riots, that can happen. Theft and vandalism, fires and explosion, large power failures. For example, if there are people in Florida right now who've been without power for a while. There are people in North Carolina that have been incredibly struggling, and businesses in that town are struggling and or shut down because they can't function in the current environment. Disasters happen. Transportation breakdowns, strikes, service provider failures, cloud provider failures. And that's why, as a rule, when it comes to, say, wide area networking, you always use 2 different providers, and you never make sure that they're the same provider, which is why most businesses wouldn't use a single cloud. And 98% of enterprises use more than one cloud because they're planning for the cloud provider to actually fail. And that can occur with a hacking event, a control plane failure, or a major network failure. So we'll get to some calculations in a minute. Actually, what we'll probably do is I see 1 or 2 questions. We'll take a few questions and then we'll get to it. So we've talked about that. Now we also have to do a likelihood assessment. So we have to think about what would be the impact if something big happens. And then we also have to think about what is the likelihood of that impact. So if you're in Miami, if you're in West Palm Beach, Florida, Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, Port St. Lucie, Florida, there's a pretty big risk of a hurricane. You know what? Where my wife's in Philadelphia today, but where our home is in New Jersey, where we used to live, there was a chance of a blizzard. Guess what? That was the risk there. Hurricanes, it was 60 miles or 50 miles away from the ocean, or 40. Hurricanes weren't that big of a risk. They happened, but they weren't a big risk. But a blizzard sure was. So, when you're building a business and you're building disaster plans and business continuity plans, If you've got a business in New York, you probably have a snow removal budget. In Miami, you may have to spend more money on your generators and your backup generators and more hurricane planning. So we have to think about that. So we're going to talk about next when we come back how to calculate some of these actual calculations, and we're going to have some fun with it. But the likelihood assessment is there. So typically speaking, when we're dealing with the frequency of something or what it's worth, it brings us to this expected value type calculation. And I want you to think in terms of expected value. I'll gently introduce the concept right now, and then so you can see what it means, and then we'll get to the real concept. So for example, if I have something, let me bring it over here, that's worth $1 million. Let's say 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So if I have something that's worth $1 million, let's say it's a lottery win, and you have a 10% chance of winning, which would be incredible chances to win this $1 million lottery. And I hope all of that happens for all of you. But here's the way we would actually calculate this. We would multiply the 1 million times 10%. And that would basically give us $100,000. And the reality is this: from a risk mitigation or a business calculation, we have $100,000 here. Come on. And I'll fix this. And if you really think about this, if you had $1 million ticket that was a 10% chance of winning, your net effect is you have $100,000 here. Oops, I made a little boo-boo here with my math. And you could literally take that amount, that expected value, and then sell your ticket to a bank or get some form of an insurance policy on a ticket like that. And that's the way businesses calculate most expenses. So when we get involved in these types of calculations, it's going to feel a lot like that MBA kind of calculation. If you've ever been to an MBA program and you've had to calculate the expected value of an opportunity. But if not, it was just a pre-warmer. We'll answer a few questions, and then what we will do is we will get into the calculations themselves. And so, Chris, let's see if there's any questions that popped in. I saw a couple.
All right, let's take a look. So from Solomon, they're asking, what courses should I take before facing the CCSP?
This course, this is the course that you so I want you to take this course. We are covering the CCSP course. And Mark's going to give you a different technical perspective. And that's great because I'm coming at it from a hardcore architect. Mark's coming at it from a 50% engineer, 50% architect, because he's done both roles. I'm coming at it from the perspective of a tech career coach with a long time, and I'm looking at it from the MBA perspective in terms of opportunity cost of your time. So Solomon, if your whole goal is to pass the CCSP exam, I would take this course. I would get our book that we're giving away completely free, and I would buy the free. I wouldn't buy the free. I would buy the book from the ISC Squared from Michael Chappelle. And that's exactly what I would do. Now, as we start covering a lot of content in cloud security, I'd figure out what I really want to do with my life. For example, if you want to be a cloud security architect, there's a lot of business acumen, leadership, sales, executive presence, and there's also going to be some other things you're going to need to dive deeper in, things like networking, compute, those kinds of things. So there's that. If I wanted to be a security engineer on the cloud, then I would figure out what kind of security engineer I wanted to be. So that means if I wanted to be an offensive security engineer, I would learn Kali Linux and how to hack and other things. If I wanted to be a defensive engineer, I would take this and I'd start getting hands-on with various products based upon the engineering field you want to be. For example, a data loss prevention engineer would do something different than an engineer that's working on an organization's demilitarized zone. So why don't we do this? I run almost every week a question and answer session where you can basically tell me your career goals and Mark and I will answer them. If your goal is to be a cloud security architect, join us on the completely free webinar we have on Thursday, and we'll dive deep into what we do in these roles. It'll be on Zoom, and you can ask me any career question you want, and it's completely free, and I'll do anything I can, and my team will to help you completely free on this webinar. So there's that. So Mark, if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, so it really depends on where you're going to be starting from. Okay, and that's generally the response we'll get from people. But I will put it this way. Let's say you know nothing about technology. You probably don't want to immediately jump into something like the CCSP. You kind of want to build up your foundations a little bit from that perspective. Something that I would generally recommend to people, and this is more if you're going to go that, let me take the certification route. Okay. The other one is take the training here, take the study guide, and make it a journey about learning the information, not with the intent to passing the exam. That should be a byproduct of you taking in the knowledge. Now, when it goes to actually what should you take before the CCSP, from a strategic point of view, I would tell people go for the CISSP. And the reason is you get a holistic view of security first. And then what you can do is you tag on, it's like an add-on to the CISSP, is the CCSP. And that way also what you're doing is you're overlapping certain topics. And I know there's a question about it that we'll get to it, we'll answer it, but there's an overlap between the two exams. And that way you can get a better handle on the different topics and just take the cloud security aspects as an add-on to it. So that's what I generally recommend. Go with the CISSP first and then move over to the cloud security one. All right, the next question is from Bernard. He's asking, how does knowing AI affect or impact our ability to obtain cloud security jobs?
It doesn't. So if you want to know cloud security, learn cloud security. Now, you will still need to understand various forms of AI and how data works and how data is going to be protected. But the biggest problem we have in technology careers is people learn somebody else's job. If your focus is cloud security, you have three options. Option one is a cloud security architect, which is designing systems. Option two, and you will never touch the systems in this role. Option two is a defensive engineer, which is an engineer that protects against threats. Option three is an offensive engineer or a ethical hacker that breaks into systems. Each one of these careers requires extremely different training, and there's almost no overlap between any of them. So if you want to get a job in cloud security, focus your career on cloud security. And I am going to say this more as a joke, but this is where people hurt their technology careers. If I'm hiring an airplane pilot, I don't care if they went to medical school, law school, have a degree in economics, finance, or a great babysitter. I care about their ability to do that job. I've interviewed 6,000 people in the last 25 years, and I got to tell you, 90% of the people have spread their careers so thin that they tried to learn a lot of people's jobs, and I couldn't hire any of them. I was able to hire 50 out of those last 6,000. So if you want security architecture, join us in that webinar. We'll come down to it. Let's bring in the next one.
All right, next question is from Paul. And if you don't, Mike, I'm going to answer that question because I got a couple of numbers for Paul. But he's asking, how much overlap does this have with the CISSP? I got my CISSP already. Are there any particular chapters that are review as opposed to the new material? So I'm going to give you an approximate. There's about 60 to 70% is overlap between the 2D exams. Remember, they're from the same organization based on the same standards, but we're adding on now the cloud piece. When it comes to the actual which chapters of review, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. For example, if you look at the CISP domain number 1, which deals with security and risk management, you're talking about 80 to 90% overlap. So what you're looking there for is you're looking for the cloud specifics that are going to deal with what does the, let's say the SLA and the vendor engagement look like for the cloud services. What does risk management look like in a cloud service environment? So I can't tell you specifically, go to this domain, only study this paragraph or two, and then go to the next one. But understand, 60 to 70%, there's going to be overlap. And then depending on the domain, you're looking at 90%, sometimes only 50% of overlap there. All right, let's take a look at the next question. And this is from Alan Hughes. Did you say in the earlier beginning that the data centers rely only on 2 separate electric utility providers? Please clarify.
Yes. So if you're building in a high availability data center, you typically have 2 power companies come in, with 2 sets of power transformers whenever possible. It's not necessarily always possible, but it's usually possible. And then you have primary generators and you have backup generators. And you also, after that, you typically have UPS systems to provide short-term power, but also to clean the power. So yes, that's why if you hear a cloud provider say they have a power failure and it took down their data center, it's going to be either that they were security hacked and it took down their systems, which were supposed to deal with their redundant power. They didn't know how to build a data center, which would be terrifying, or they had some other failure and they called it a cloud provider. And we've seen incidents of that. But a well-designed data center has 2 power companies, multiple sets of transformers. And now the cloud providers are actually buying nuclear power facilities for themselves to run these.
Great. Let's see what other questions everyone had. So this is from Mones. What is the difference between cloud native and traditional cloud computing?
So cloud native is a made-up term. Here's what cloud native means: trying to do things as much as you can in a serverless and in a microservices sort of environment. And you can do that in your data center, or you can do it in the cloud provider. Traditional cloud computing is using the combination of everything. If we've got something that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at high frequency, cloud native is going to cost us, a serverless, for example, will cost way too much. Cloud native doesn't typically offer some of the performance that we can get in a virtual machine-based architecture. For highest performance, we want a virtual machine. For efficiency, we may want containers. So realistically speaking, we can't have a preference on cloud native. We can't have a preference on traditional. What do the business needs drives the application. But cloud native is if you basically if you reprogram everything you want to run on the cloud, which sometimes makes sense and sometimes it doesn't.
All right, let's take a look at the next question. And this is from James. What cloud provider will the training be on? And James, I'll give you my 2 cents. Mike will follow up. The beauty about the CCSP is that it's vendor agnostic, meaning the concepts, the theory, and the eventual practical application that you'll gain from this type of training is going to be impacting no matter which cloud provider you go with. Now, you will have to learn, perhaps, let's say, if you're dealing with Amazon, let's say with Microsoft, let's say those are the 2 cloud providers, you're going to create your public hybrid cloud environment. You may have to learn some additional things that are specific to that cloud provider and how they secure, let's say, their specific version of a storage unit, or how they secure particular things with their virtual machine. But the overall concepts will apply to either, no matter which cloud provider you're working with.
So yeah, and I'm gonna motor through a couple quick ones real quick. Go ahead, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
How long does one need to prepare for the CCSP? How fast do you study? I spent 5 days preparing for the CISSP and passed it, but I know other people that have spent 6 months. Learn it until you know the material and you know it well. Chris, let's go to the next one. Everybody learns at a different speed.
So from Nigel, they're asking, are there any supplementary labs you'd be recommending to get good hands-on experience with cloud security?
I want to take that question, and I want to also take the question about how does somebody get hands-on experience. Nigel, we need to know what your job is. For example, if you wanted to be a cloud security architect and you spent time setting up firewalls, IDS, IPS systems, and you're writing access lists everywhere, it will teach you nothing related to the cloud security architect job, because you're going to be creating technology roadmaps and analyzing IT systems and identifying areas for improvement and designing future state architecture models and setting up compliance with security frameworks and aligning IT initiatives with strategy. And you won't be allowed to touch the technology. But in that role, a presentation, a thought leadership document, a responding to an RFI, RFP, RFQ is actual hands-on experience. Now, by comparison, if you're training to be an ethical hacker in cloud security, hands-on experience is you going on Kali Linux and hacking into systems and determining how to do it. If your goal is to become a defensive security engineer, then the right labs are for you to work with firewalls and IDS, IPS systems and data loss prevention systems and log and SIEM systems. So the career you want determines the labs. Maybe if we have some time later this week, I'll set aside some time to do it. I'm a little under the weather. But if not, Mark and I will hold one special day in the next 2 weeks where we can talk about your exact career on Zoom and the different types of labs and projects that would be appropriate for you. depending on, I woke up with a little bit of the flu this morning. So I'm waiting to see where I feel a little healthier, but we can do something like that.
All right, let's take a look at a next question. And this is from Sandeep. Do the course also discuss on any real-time project tasks and experiences?
Sandeep, I don't know what you mean. In our 1,000-hour cloud architect program, we do real-world architecture things. Architecture, responding to RFIs, RFPs, sales presentations, leadership presentations, business cases, and all of that. Because that's what we actually do. But we have 1,000 hours to do this. This is a 30-hour presentation. And the problem is, what project tasks even matter? I mean, if you're an architect and you do a bunch of projects and you go to someone and they say, okay, how do you design my demilitarized zone? And you know how to set up a firewall, you don't know anything. And I mean that in a respectful sort of way. You know how to set up a firewall. Likewise, the architect that knows how to set up federated identity and how to design it, but doesn't know how to actually configure it, doesn't know how to do the engineer's job. So these projects and tasks have to be related to our actual career. And that's where people go wrong, if they learn the wrong skills.
All right, let's see what other questions we have available. Are you still okay going for a couple of questions, Mike?
I will, you know what, I want to get back to the content. So
Okay.
let's do this. Chris, kind of keep track of those questions. And what we'll do is we'll find some time to basically invite people to Zoom inside of the next 2 weeks. And we'll have things and we'll just relate it straight to questions. And that way we can have a face-to-face conversation so things don't get lost in translation. Let's get back to the content here. So, because now we're going to get geeky on business stuff. So give me a hashtag CCSP. And that way I know you're awake, alert, and oriented. And we're trying to really focus in our discussion today to get you through the course material. This is a very serious certification. It is a significant one. And because it's one of those significant ones, we need a lot of time. This is much more challenging than a cloud provider certification. And that's why it holds so much more weight. So now we're at the point where we're basically speaking going to start calculating an organization's risks. So, and you know, one of the questions in the chat box was also related to, if you've got ambiguous requirements, what do you do? If you have ambiguous requirements, it's because you didn't ask the questions correctly. And you need to set up another meeting with that client and ask all those questions you need to get to your goals. So keep that in the back of your mind. It's up to you to clarify things, because you can't design things with lack of clarity. So in calculating an organization's risk, we have to calculate an exposure factor. And an exposure factor is, what is the percentage or the likelihood that damage to a specific asset will actually occur? So what does that mean? So when we created that expected value of an opportunity, and I gave you the example of $1 million lottery ticket with a 10% chance of winning, that exposure factor was effectively 10%. It's the same thing we're talking about. So when it comes to exposure factor, you may hear the term loss potential. And because, you know, it's the actual risk, which talks about our risk of losing something, not the actual thing. So when we talk about an exposure factor, it's going to be measured in percentage. Now, how do we get this exposure factor? Well, that's some really cool statistics, which are way beyond the CCSP, the CISSP. And these are your quantitative work people that might be in the actuarial sciences with the PhDs in advanced math, that are really good at calculating these heavy duty statistics, and they can often give it to us. So there's that. So the exposure factor is the likelihood of it occurring. And the single loss expectancy is actually the potential annual loss per year based upon a single threat. So a single threat. So let's talk about what that math would actually look like. Bear with me a second and I'll bring this formula in so we can actually talk about it, and I'll show you how we would look at it. Delete. Bear with me a second. So if we want to think about that single loss expectancy that business would actually face, it goes a lot into that expected value of an opportunity kind of math I was teaching you earlier, where what you can basically see is we have the asset and the asset's value. So let me just try to make it to the point where it's easy to see. So let's say this is the secret formula to a brand new drug for a blockbuster drug that's worth $1 billion. And the exposure factor is the risk that something would occur. So what does this realistically mean? If we take the same situation, if we've got an asset that's worth $1 billion, so we've got this $1 billion asset, and we've got a 5% risk that asset would be compromised that year. For that particular asset, that's the math. And why don't you show me that you're actually awake and actually solve that formula? What is 0.05 times $1 billion? And that would be working on the assumption that this $1 billion asset would be compromised in a breach once every 20 years. Now, honestly, assuming something's going to be breached once every 20 years is a little low right now. But if we take 10% of this, we've got what, 100 million? So 5% of that is going to be a half of that, but I'll let you guys do the math. And before I get to the next thing, somebody asked probably one of the most dangerous questions in cloud computing. Should I learn a cloud provider? And I'm going to tell you to learn the cloud. And the reason I'm going to say this is all clouds are the same. The only thing that changes the names. And if somebody only knows one cloud in a world where 98% of businesses actually use more than one cloud, they can only work at 2% of the companies. But if they learn the cloud, they can work anywhere because it's all the same technology. So good job. You guys are calculating it, you're seeing it, you're understanding that's the risk of this particular asset. Let's have fun. Let's do one more. So let's take this asset as $100,000. And the risk of it getting hacked is 10%. So in this particular case, we have 10% of $100,000, right? Which means the risk that is actually here is $10,000. You guys did a good job getting through that math. You calculated it as $50 million for the 0.5%. I have no qualms that you're going to be able to calculate 10% of $100,000 being $10,000. So that's really what we were talking about with that single loss expectancy. Now, the next mathematical formula we actually need is going to be something called the annualized rate of occurrence. So the annualized rate of occurrence is the expected frequency that a threat will occur in a single year. So if we think it's going to happen once a year, that annualized rate of occurrence is 1. If we think it'll happen once every 5 years, that annualized rate of occurrence is 20% or 0.2. And again, this annual rate of occurrence is going to be coming from these brilliant statisticians that are going to be working with consulting companies and look through large amounts of data. And they're going to be running their multivariate statistics and they're in NOVAs and they're going to be calculating with a p-value of less than 0.05 and all that fancy statistic stuff that you guys may have remembered in graduate school. And if you don't know it, don't worry about it unless you're in a world where you have to analyze the effectiveness of a study. But there's that. So this is going to be calculated from statistics. So the next thing we need to think about, and this is critical, because if you don't get this, and I mean it, if you don't get this, nobody's ever going to adopt your security stuff. You're going to be going to that company and you're going to tell them you got a great security thing and it's going to be, $50 million. And they're going to be like, there's the door. I don't want to waste $50 million on this, but Mrs. Client, you have a $287 million risk this year. Okay, that $50 million seems awfully cheap. So that's why we have to do this. So the next thing we have to calculate is the annual loss expectancy, annualized loss expectancy. And what is this? This is where we take every single asset and the risk of each one being compromised and we put it together. So you'll recall that the single loss expectancy, which we calculated together, was the asset value times the exposure factor. So here's really what we're actually doing here. We're taking this single loss expectancy and multiplying it by the annual rate, which very much is the same thing. So here's where it's going to get interesting. And I'll do the math. I'm going to get a little geeky. Mark will probably get geekier tech-wise this week than I will. I'll probably get geekier on MBA-type math. But let's say an organization has a whole lot of risks, okay? So this is one risk. Risk number one is this $100,000 with 10% risk that it occurs. So here's the risk. Here is $10,000. Now the organization also has asset number two. And asset number two is worth $2 million. Oops. And for this particular thing, there is a 15% chance because it's in a risky asset in a risky place. So now we've got over here, we've got the 2 million, and we've got to multiply that times 50%. So that's going to be, if I do the math correct in my head, 300,000. And let's say we've got a third asset that's under risk, and this risk is a $500,000 asset, and the risk of it getting compromised that year is 0.1 or 10%. So we know this is 50,000. So when we start getting into this annualized loss expectancy and total losses, what we have to do is we have to add these things up. So 350 and 360, that's kind of the total losses that we can think about. So in some ways, we're going to have to calculate this because this is going to be the determining factor of how much money we're going to be able to get from our clients. So we're going to have to calculate this for every single thing. So we understand the business needs. We now understand the business risks. We've now calculated the quantitative information. Now we have to prioritize resources. So looking at these resources right here by the exposure factor, which is the biggest risk to the business? The $10,000 risk, the $50,000 risk, or the $300,000 risk? Let me know in the chat box. But I hope it's obvious to you. One of these risks can hurt the business far more than the other. That, generally speaking, is going to be the first risk that the organization should manage. So if you'll see this $300,000 risk, generally speaking, assuming it's not too challenging to manage that risk, that's going to be the first thing we fix because it's got the biggest impact to the business, followed by the $50,000 risk. And for that $10,000 risk, either we'll mitigate it or we'll transfer it to another insurance company, or we'll basically say, look, we're just going to accept that risk of the $10,000 thing because it's not that big. So see, great. I see lots of you are actually seeing, you're choosing the right thing. Emmanuel, I know where you got your MBA from, so good job. For the rest of you, fantastic. And I kind of hope this also makes sense. So now that we've talked about that, we understand we start with the highest risk and we move down from the highest to the lowest. We make sure we evaluate every single possible risk along the way that we can. And we choose to accept some, mitigate some, what have you. So in order to do this, this is a big job of an architect, a cloud security architect, a cloud architect, any architect generally. We have to evaluate all possible trade-offs that we actually have. And then we have to run a cost-benefit analysis with that client to figure out what's in their best interest. And in order to figure out what they need to do most, we need to gain a clear understanding of the client and the client's organization's needs, their business, what's normal for their business, traditional things that go on inside that business. We have to understand their key business processes. We have to evaluate their starting point and the potential benefits of risk mitigation. Some risks make sense to mitigate, some don't. So we've got to do that cost-benefit analysis. We've got to evaluate all trade-offs. And the trade-offs could be in the technology. The trade-offs could be in the risk mitigation approach. But a lot of this is business. So I hope this thing. So now let's think about the primary drivers were people were going to the cloud in the first place. So initially, people were migrating to the cloud because they thought it was going to be cheaper. They thought that. And that's what's in your general, junior level, intro level cloud computing course. It's cheaper. Unfortunately, businesses found that it's usually more expensive, substantially more expensive than what they were paying in their data center with regards to total cost of ownership. So you may hear of the cloud repatriation movement. This is the best opportunity for cloud architects in the world to create so many more cloud architect jobs. Why? Because people started loving the cloud. They love it. They love the agility, the infrastructure as code, the auto scaling. But now they can build data centers, and these data centers can run software like OpenStack or Nutanix, and they can run, again, every feature and functionality of the public cloud for the most part, have greater security and greater performance and lower cost. So that's why all cloud architects like me are helping organizations build their private clouds in addition to public clouds and hybrid clouds. And that's why everybody's multi-cloud. So we understand where they got there. Why are people staying in the cloud? It's agile and it scales well. So we'll talk a little bit more about the finances and metrics that think about going to the cloud. Generally speaking, the driver of the cloud was in the data center. We have to build to peak capacity. And I know we talked a little about this earlier. We built for peak. In the cloud, we build for average. And if we have lower demand systems on the cloud all year long and then auto scale, cloud's often cheaper. Now, if we have to run these systems at full capacity all the time long, what you have to understand is the cloud provider has to buy the same servers as the business. They buy the same storage as the business. They buy the same networking for the most part as any other business would. They have to run these clouds. Then they have to have a sales force of 30, 40, 50,000, several $100,000 per year employees to go sell it. They've got to have another team that has to do marketing. They've got another team that needs to maintain it and provide tech support. And that's why cloud computing typically gets much more expensive in reality in most cases than people thought. And that's why the cloud providers have to charge more. Same way rent has to be higher than the landlord's cost to buy the property and finance the property. This is a landlord-tenant type business. So people went there and they were thrilled with the pay for what you use. So I want you to think of cloud computing systems as this and serverless systems as this. I live in Florida. And where I live in Florida, everything is 5 miles away. I get in my car. I drive 6 miles to the PT center. I drive to the yoga studio pretty much every day. So I have 2 trips in my car. I bought my car. I own my car. And I paid payments until the car was paid off. And then I just drive my car and put fuel in it and do maintenance on it. Now, imagine I had to take an Uber for my 2 car rides twice a day, 7 days a week. And then on Sunday, I had to go to 2 75-mile rides to a yoga studio that's in Palm Beach County that I visit a lot. Now, if I had to do that on an Uber, that might cost me $2,000, $3,000 a month. But I could buy a Mercedes, pay $900 a month, and drive back and forth wherever I went. In that particular case, it made sense to buy a car. But what if I only used that car once every 3 days and I only went 2 miles? It would be cheaper to use an Uber. And that's why we have to understand the use and how we're going to use these things. Because sometimes the cloud's a lot cheaper. Sometimes Uber is cheaper than owning your own car and dealing with parking in the city and dealing with car payments and maintenance. Sometimes it's much cheaper to own the car. We have to understand the use case. And that's why architecture is this way. And that's why we can't have any preconceived notions in our minds. Now, one thing to think about is when we actually buy an asset. So let's say we were to buy a next generation firewall for $50,000. And let's say that next generation firewall also costs $35,000 a year to rent it on the cloud, because that's the kind of things you would cost. $50,000 one time, maybe $40,000, $50,000 each year to rent. So you can see it'll be cheaper in the data center. But when I buy that firewall for $50,000, my accountant uses something called depreciation. So depreciation is a fake accounting expense that basically is, okay, your thing is worth less than it used to be. That's how much money you lost. So from an accounting perspective, the organization will take the earnings, they will subtract the depreciation and whatever, and then that'll be what their tax base is. By comparison, when an organization migrates to the cloud, because it's not a capital expense, it's not expense via depreciation, it's calculated as a write-off. So if a company spends $100,000 a month in the cloud, they can write off that entire $100,000 every single month off of their earnings and potentially get some tax savings. So kind of think about that. That's the other side of the OpEx. What people like about OpEx is that they can write it off very well. And, think of it that way. Now, another great capacity with cloud computing, which is one of the more smart or intelligent things, which typically drives cost down and drives performance up, is something called cloud bursting. And in cloud bursting, I have my data center, and when I need additional capacity, it goes straight to the cloud. My cloud software just adds that capacity on the cloud, and that way I can add capacity when needed and still keep my data center. Let's talk about where things do get cheaper in the cloud. Generally speaking, in my data center, I need more people and more sophisticated people. I might need a couple of $300,000 network engineers in the data center if I need good uptime. I might. Whereas on the cloud, much of the networking is done, so I need less sophisticated network engineers and I need less of them. In the cloud, because so much of it is code driven, it is typically simpler and I need less people. I don't need as many people with knowledge of the infrastructure, and infrastructure people get expensive. On the cloud, I can deal with the more software side of people, which are typically a bit cheaper. Managing my own systems, I got to put a lot of time and effort and have a lot of people in place. On the cloud, they have a lot of the management built in, so I need less sophisticated people, which cost me much less money on the cloud. Now, not the cloud architects, they're expensive. I'm talking about the actual people that actually do the work, the actual hands-on building. So by organizations migrating some of their systems to the public cloud, it enables them to either reduce the staffing that they have or divest from a population of IT staff. It may make it easier to outsource to lower cost parts of the world, which is one of the reasons we teach cloud architecture, security architecture, AI architecture, and enterprise architecture, because nobody can outsource an architect because of all the human to human work that we actually do. We're not like engineers where the AI can write code. In the architecture world, your whole life is about meetings and conversations and leading and discussions and things like that. So think about that as you plan your technology careers. All careers are good and you can get anyone you want with the right training. So when we think about operational costs, some of them go up sky high when we go to the cloud, specifically the rental or use of the technology. But in our data center, we typically need to buy the real estate or lease the real estate. We've got a lot of power infrastructure that we've got to bring into our data center that we don't have to worry about in the cloud provider. We've got a lot of cooling that we need to build into our data centers on the cloud provider or that. So how does the cloud provider get around it? You can go to Dell and you can buy a server for about $350,000, and you can rent that server on the cloud for about $6 million over the course of a few years. So they charge a lot more for each thing, but you're not buying the power transformers and you're not paying for cables bringing in power. And, it depends on the business. We have to build a business case to determine what makes sense. Another benefit organizations go from going to cloud providers is it cuts down the regulatory costs. And here's the reason why. Many cloud providers have already designed a lot of their backend things to be compliant with specific industry mandates. PCI DSS compliance, for example. And by having systems that already comply to this, it makes it easier and less burdensome for you. So you're transferring some of the regulatory things to the cloud provider, which means you may pay more for it, but you may have to spend less to do it yourself based upon the use. And customers can buy specific service contracts that will reduce the effort needed to comply with the various individual control frameworks. So some of the responsibility can be transferred, but the ultimate responsibility for all cybersecurity remains inside the organization. And who are the people that are most responsible for the cybersecurity of the organization? The company's executives. So keep that in the back of your mind. Now, another thing that gets very simple with cloud computing is backup. Generally speaking, in a business, they have backup. So, and they typically would take a tape infrastructure, ship these backup tapes to a secure location, make sure they're secured along the way, make sure they're encrypted. With cloud computing, it kind of automates so many of our backups. And we're not just backing up data, although we can if we want. We can back up actual images of virtual machines. So it gets very easy to deal with backup and disaster recovery strategies in the cloud. And the cloud offers us many new types of disaster recovery strategies that were never before possible. Because before we had to have other facilities that would have some equipment in it, for example. Now with the cloud, I can have my systems on AWS. I can have my disaster recovery thing sitting in Google. I can have my data, my database in Google, and should something bad happen, launch an infrastructure as script, as code script on Google, and then poof, Google is up and operational, and I don't care if my primary cloud's down. Possibility one. Possibility two is if I've got a website, I can have that website running on my primary cloud provider. Let's say it's AWS, and I can have a small version of that website running on Google. And if my main website crashes, all that traffic could be dynamically shifted to Google. That capacity could auto scale on Google, and within 45 minutes, I'm up and operational. So there's so much of that we should talk about. And that's one of the things that makes it here. We've got about 4 different cloud disaster recovery options. We talk about disaster recovery, we'll talk about them. But understand that that itself makes it very cost effective to do disaster recovery. Want a secret? Don't do disaster recovery on the same cloud. I mean, don't think that if you're on AWS that you should do disaster recovery to another region in AWS. That's ridiculous. And here's the reason why. If AWS gets hit with a global network outage, a security event outage, or has a control plane failure, you lose the whole cloud, including your disaster recovery site. So do your disaster recovery on a different cloud. And if you're multi-cloud, like most people, half on AWS and half on Azure, for example, use Google or use the Oracle cloud as disaster recovery. Don't do disaster recovery on your primary systems. Now, another thing that cloud can do, and it can really help businesses with regards to cloud governance. So here's what I mean. Early in my youth, when I got my first network engineering job, I was hired as a senior engineer, and I left engineering and was a lead architect within 3 months. But I had a job and they called me Sniffer Boy. So if anybody knows what a protocol analyzer or a sniffer is, I was literally speaking, plugging in a protocol analyzer on the network, trying to figure out what was going on that network. And I found music servers. I found this wacky thing, this backdoor, this backdoor, this backdoor. And in a data center environment, it's that you're going to see that kind of stuff. On the cloud, it becomes pretty easy to create a mandate. This is your golden build of your operating system. This is your standard, and you can only launch certain things that meet these standards. So we can automate some of the protection of our systems. We can ensure that our cloud service meets our functional, technical, security requirements. We can create a somewhat centralized repository with an environment to see things and find things. And what we're doing is we're trying to reduce something called shadow IT. And everybody's got to see shadow IT. You know your buddy in your company that has a workaround to the security things your company has. There's always somebody that you know that wants to work from the beach, that does this remote control of this thing for this thing or this thing. We all know them. At one point in my youth, I did it, but I didn't do it for very long because I realized the cybersecurity impacts. But we all get it. That's called shadow IT. We're trying to avoid that. And the cloud and things like the things that by the cloud providers enable us to do this. Now, cloud providers are going to give us 3 to 4 operating models we can talk about. Operating model 1, infrastructure as a service. Here's what this is. A rental data center that's no different than any data center in the entire world. In that, you get your virtual machines, you get your containers, you get your virtual routers, your virtual firewalls, virtual version of what we always have. It works great. So there's that. Okay. So that's infrastructure as a service. There's the concept of platform as a service, where basically speaking, you pretty much upload your code and it sort of works. And a lot of your system is deployed and a lot of managed for you. Now, when you do that, The provider owns all the infrastructure, and you're generally providing the code. That means someone else is providing you the infrastructure. So you have to trust that they're doing it, and they're doing it to your security needs. Now, understand this. With platform as a service or something like this, they have to meet the needs of the average business. It is a mass-produced product for millions of companies. It has to be the mass-produced product. So think of it as going to McDonald's or going to Burger King. As long as your hamburger, your way, fits inside of what you get in a fast food restaurant, that's platform. That's that kind of concept of platform as a service. Infrastructure as a service, well, that's like going to my mother-in-law. She came here from Greece. My family owned a Greek restaurant. She's the best chef I've ever met in my entire life. And if I ask her to make me my hamburger my way, and she uses all the best Greek spices, oh, they're really good, and she makes it with love, and she does it, and it's perfect, I can get it exactly the way I want. So infrastructure as a service, full capability, full customization. Platform as a service, you get what you get. It's available to you, and for the most part, it's agile. Software as a service is where somebody actually gives you software, sells you software, and manages everything for you. So think of the Google Office. Think of Microsoft's Online 365, which is completely different than when you've got a business that's got their own manually run Exchange servers and Active Directory servers. That's infrastructure as a service. We will also potentially talk about function as a service, and that's where you upload just a little bit of code and it does something. Like an AWS Lambda function, an Azure function, you'll hear it referred to as function as a service. And we can do these in private clouds like Nutanix and OpenStack. Of course, we can do it in all public cloud providers as well. Now, when we deal with the customer and infrastructure as a service, the cloud provider does the underlying infrastructure, like their routers and their switches, and the customer must own and manage the security of the virtualized servers, which unfortunately are on shared hardware, and we'll talk about the implications of that. Block storage, disk volumes, object storage, buckets, network capacity. You have to manage it, you maintain it, and it's as close as you get to the real deal. And that platform as a service, again, is going to be something like anything that's pre-made for you, where you just pop in your data and it works. So think of it as like a cloud managed database, for example, and you probably, you could use, for example, an AWS Aurora, if you think about it. I mean, you can't in multi-cloud worlds, and I'll talk about why you can't, but let's assume you wanted an AWS DynamoDB or an Aurora, and I'll talk about why we can't use them in reality. You don't have to think about the virtual machine. You don't have to think about its storage. You don't really have to think about all the IOPS, because it'll just kind of scale itself all for you. You get that. Now, why can't we use, 50% of these cloud services? They're proprietary and they don't work multi-cloud. So in multi-cloud, we throw away DynamoDB and we bring in MongoDB or Apache Cassandra. We get rid of an Amazon Aurora, for example, and we swap it out with an Oracle database or MicroSQL or MariaDB or MySQL. We get rid of things like the Elastic Container Service, and we swap it out with a Kubernetes service that runs on all clouds. So, for example, if we look at IBM OpenShift, we can pop that on all three cloud providers, and that way we can lose a cloud and still keep our Kubernetes things. Instead of AWS WAF, we swap it out with a Cisco firewall, a Palo Alto firewall, a Fortinet firewall, a Checkpoint firewall, or some other firewall that has more features, more functionalities than we can put in most clouds. So kind of hope that makes sense and helps. All right, so I'm going to talk about various forms of cloud computing environments. Chris, how many minutes has it been since we've done questions? I want to be mindful. Okay, it's been about 30. So let's take questions. I'm going to keep them related to the content. I will definitely have a how to get your first cloud architect job webinar this week at some point. which are all going to be related to architecture career questions. But I will make sure that Mark and I, in the next 2 weeks, dedicate a 2-hour time to literally speaking, answering any kind of cybersecurity career questions, because we've trained so many cloud security architects and cybersecurity architects over the years, and I've trained them recently in our cloud architect program. So I'm going to make sure we answer your questions.
All right. Our first question is from Anthony. Nice to see you again, Anthony. He's asking, in the video from 2 weeks ago, you said that the CISSP was far superior to the CCSP certification, which was more of an introductory certification. Should we be focusing on the CISSP and look at the CCSP as a stepping stone?
So they're different, Anthony. If I had to pick one, I would say that the CISSP is my overall favorite. But let's talk about what it's going to take for someone to get a CISSP properly. A good CISP bootcamp is going to be $5,000 to $10,000. And we provide that in our cloud architect program, which you're a member of. The reality is a good CCSP program is going to cost $5,000 to $6,000 for the week. And we wanted to give away something that was good and meaningful. There are substantial differences between the CISSP and the CCSP. The CISSP is everything that you might need to think about in cybersecurity. But you know where it lacks, Anthony? On cloud-specific thinking. On the thinking, when we get into data and we start talking about issues like data sovereignty, and we're going to get much deeper into various cloud things here than we would the CISSP. So, Anthony, if you really wanted to know what my three favorite cybersecurity certifications for cloud architect or for cloud security architects are, it's the CISSP, the CCSP, and the CISM. And each one of those offers something valuable. CISM has a lot of that managerial business thinking to it. The CISSP, that's just kind of like the end-to-end everything. And kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And the CCSP is cloud security.
If it's okay, Mike, I wanted to add just something a little bit for Anthony there. He mentioned introductory certification. I want to make it clear that when it comes from a holistic perspective on how security works, we consider them introductory.
Yes.
Because a lot of the other certification that you'll go for, it doesn't matter if you go for Fortinet, if you go for Palo Alto, if you go for Checkpoint, if you go for anything Cisco related, they're going to be concentrating on the implementation aspects of various vendor-specific solutions. In this case, though, the CISSP and the CCSP, we're now dealing with things that are generally considered managerial or stakeholder related, like a CISO kind of role. So I would actually consider these to be in the grander scheme of certifications that you can get out there to be at the probably expert level, if not the advanced level type of certifications, because these are generally not things that people are going to be looking for in somebody that can configure a firewall, that can configure a load balancer, that can configure, let's say, some type of specifics when it comes to storage or cloud computing in that type of environment. So just keep that in mind. These are, from that perspective, very high desired and high in demand certifications at the advanced level. All right, let's take a look at our next question, please. And this is from Narendra. What are the prerequisites for the CCSP? And as a lot of context, I answered that already for Narendra, but if you want to give your take on that as well, Mike, please go ahead.
Yeah. There are no prerequisites for pretty much any of the hardest exams. You can take the CCIE by taking the CCIE. You can take the CISSP with no prerequisites. You can take the CCSP with no prerequisites. There is one wacky thing that these do, and I want to teach you how to use this for your advantage. For any of the big certifications like the CCSP or the CISSP, they want you to have 5 years experience before you take the exam because they think it's so hard that you need 5 years of experience to pass the exam. You can pass the exam without the experience. You just get called an associate of the ISC squared. Here's why that's an advantage for you. The reason it's an advantage is if you need 5 years to pass an exam because it's so hard, but you can pass it on your own by spending 3 months, you're clearly more intelligent than the person that needed 5 years experience to be able to pass it. You're like the person that graduated college in 6 months versus the person that needed 6 years to do it. And when I took my CISSP certification, it was the thing that it was like, well, they were less restrictive on the time, but I remember saying to someone, well, it's so hard, I need 5 years, and we did it in 5 days to see how quickly I can learn. And that was kind of the thing. So yeah, there's no prerequisites what we're talking about, and it's all about you knowing how to sell you. So the person that graduated college at 12 most likely is smarter than the person that graduated at 26. Show that you took the hardest thing and then you could do it, and that's how you sell you.
And Narendra, I did answer it for you. I gave you a link. There are requirements on actually gaining the status with the IC Square organization. But even that, I told you that you can get associate status instead of the actual membership status. But for all those that did not necessarily read this in the chat, I just want to let you know, none of that is going to prevent you from gaining the knowledge and upskilling yourself. And going out into the field and actually demonstrating your competency in this. So this is particular just when it comes to obtaining a member status with the IC Square organization. Aside from that, no prerequisites and really no requirements. Only requirement is show up, be willing to learn, and put in the work. What is our next question? Let's take a look. And this is from CyberGRC. And Mike, I'm going to let you answer this one. You might have been waiting to see that.
Security architect training. Absolutely. We've been training cloud security architects in our Cloud Architect Career Development Program. I'm thinking of Delroy Bad, who got his first cloud security architect job as his first tech job out of this program. I'm thinking of R, who recently took an incredible security job. Apparently, cloud security was beneath him. They gave him a job on top of that where he worked. I'm thinking of Quentin. I'm thinking of so many cloud security architects that I've trained in this program, and they're doing so well. If you want to learn more, join us on the webinar on Thursday on how to get your first architect job. And Mark and I will talk much deeper. But yes, I've been training cloud security architects for a long time.
Yeah. And so everybody knows we have a little saying in the actual technology domain. We say that security is pervasive. So regardless of what particular solution you're touching, if it's going to be networking, if it's going to be completely secured, if it's going to be storage, etc., cloud, they all have an aspect of security, and we train on all of them. Next question is from Foolish the Crow. It says, hello, is the CCSP more for people going into cloud security? If I'm looking for a cert, do you just want to answer that first and then I give you the second part, Mark, or Mike, or the whole question first? Do you have a preference?
And then I'm gonna take one more after this. So you can provide your answer.
Okay, so let me finish reading it. So he's asking, is the CCSP more for people going into cloud security? Or if I'm looking for a cert to beef up my knowledge to become a cloud architect, should I go for the CCSP or the CISSP? So go ahead.
Good.
Okay, I was going to say there is overlap between both certifications. And depending on how well you did on one or the other, there's about 60 to 70% overlap. Now, there is advantages to going and getting the CISSP first. And the advantages are that it deals with a holistic picture of security. It's not just specific to cloud security. So there is something to say to go first for the CISSP and then add on the expertise of the cloud security. Now, for people that want to become cloud architects, guess what? It's still the same idea, especially if you don't have a good foundation. Get a foundation done with the CISSP, and then add on, upskill yourself with the specifics when it comes to cloud security. What's your take?
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect answer. I want to get to the other two that popped in from Noble and Adeyemo because they're very essential.
So from Noble, he's asking, so will you say taking vendor-specific certifications like Palo Alto is an introductory level?
Yes, and I'm going to explain to you why the CCIE, the hardest of all certification exams in the world, is intro level. So here's what intro level things are about. How do I configure something? And here's what the CCIE, as soon as I finished it, I realized exactly how much I didn't know. And then I spent the next 25 years learning. So let's define what intro level is. You go to the router, the firewall, and you configure it. That's intro level. Let's come up one more level. And that's technician work, realistically speaking. We'll come up one level, which is the engineering role. The engineering role understands the technology, understands how the technology works, understands how to performance tune that technology, understands how to optimize that technology, and is an expert with being able to evaluate all aspects of the technology. So they may still build, but the building is the least of their job. This is basically what can you take the CCIE exam and they hand you a configuration guide, which tells you how to configure everything. But they know they give you a scenario when you have to know each and everything about the entire protocol in order to know what design that you're going to build later. And that's why it has a 90% failure rate with the instruction manual handed to you directly, because that's at that mid tier. Now, the senior tier is all about designing the systems and the interplay of the systems and the impact on the business. And you can start out at that senior tier, many people do, or that mid tier or that junior tier. What determines is what you're training. But if all your training is like CCNA stuff and this Google junior level intro to security stuff and this AWS intro to security stuff, you're not going to have any professional skill. You're going to have technician skills, which are always going to be at the lowest level. And the difference between someone that knows how to configure the firewall, which might get paid $60,000 a year, versus the really smart the cloud security engineer that knows how to performance tune it is $150, versus that architect that's making these managerial decisions getting paid $300,000 or $400,000 a year, because it's hard to find people that know the business and the strategy. It's real which are architects. It's very hard to understand that mid-tier engineer that really understand it. And it's super easy to find the people that took a cert that's a technician cert. Click, click, click here, and you're done, but they don't know why they're clicking or what they're clicking. So yeah, all that stuff is intro level. CCNP is intro level. Palo Alto Professional, all intro level.
And just briefly, I want to add this. We have a saying where we talk about people, processes, and technology. We call it PPT. Yep. That's what you're going to look at with a certification like the CISSP, the CCSP, and even the CISM. They're dealing with all these three facets. When you go for a vendor-specific certification, it doesn't matter if you're doing the associates, the professional, or the expert, you're dealing with technology. The people and the processes aspect is removed because they don't matter to you. You're giving tasks and things to do, or stuff, we might as well just call it stuff to do, on the implementation. But you never see the light of day of all these things that come before, right? The business drivers, the technical, and the functional requirements. That is all handled either by an architect or some type of pre-sales engineer or architect. Those are going to feed that down to you. So that's what the difference is. Yeah. And the difficulty of them really depends. For example, the CCIE, the expert level certification, is not an easy exam. It's not very easy. You might even say the CISSP to some extent, when it comes to not having hands-on, is easier than the CCIE. But they're different in the respects of what things you're dealing with. So remember, with these we're talking about a managerial view, the people, the processes, and the technology, instead of just the technology. Yeah. And you mentioned, Mike, you wanted to get to the question of Adedayo, right?
Yeah, she asked a question about the Google exam. So Adedayo, here's the Google exam. It's the name of a Google security service, which you most likely won't be able to use because it's Google proprietary, and 98% of that world uses multi-cloud and needs industrial tools, and it's how to configure that service. So you can do that exam and you won't really know anything about cybersecurity. Same with the AWS one. You'll know how to configure the AWS tools. So here's my suggestion. Take this, get a really good understanding of cloud security. And then if you want an engineering level job, get hands-on with the various things in these cloud providers, but don't just use the cloud providers. If your goal is engineering, get yourself an EVE-NG server and build your own cloud, an OpenStack cloud on that, and lock it down with some Palo Alto firewalls or Checkpoint firewalls or Fortinet ones. So really go and learn, because you're going to have to get a million times deeper than anything that's taught in those cloud providers' security certifications. They're almost technician level, but not quite, regardless of the name of them. And that's why, Mark and I made a whole course for it, and we couldn't really teach it. Although maybe one day we'll actually just teach the implementation after a course like this, potentially. And that way you can actually learn cybersecurity and then potentially learn that hands-on kind of stuff. But we want to teach you the bigger stuff that you're really going to be using, because you're going to be using a Fortinet firewall or a Palo Alto, not AWS WAF, not Google's firewall, not Azure's firewall in any real enterprise.
Yeah. So a lot of this training that you see us providing here, and also for our students, is to give you the right mindset of somebody who understands the business and then how to drive those business drivers towards a technology solution. You need that particular mindset, and it's very different compared to somebody who actually has to build or implement the technology. So that's why we generally separate them two, because otherwise it gets very confusing, and you're literally going to be sitting probably over 1,000 hours just of very specific vendor training if you add the design and the architecture into it. So, but maybe in the future, like Mike said, we'll work a little bit on the implementation piece to give people a little bit of an idea of what would it look like if you're doing some hands-on.
And I'm going to end on these two things because we've gone too long. I got to get back to the content. We currently are training cloud security architects, and they're working everywhere because I saw that question pop in. We've got lots of cloud security architect examples of people we've trained that are doing wonderfully. And SR said that the CISSP and CCSP exam thinks like a manager. Here's what they're really talking about. I saw someone, it was a networking person that went on LinkedIn today and said, "Oh, what's your favorite technology for networking as it pertains to AI, InfiniBand or Ethernet?" And about 25 people gave this girl answers. They're the people I can't ever hire. And here's the reason why. They've already had a technology selected because they love it, they're biased it, without even knowing what the business needs are. So they want you to not think like a traditional certification, click, click, click. Okay, here's the example, it's S3. And they want you to think about it and think, what are the implications of this? What are the implications of that? What are the implications of the other thing? And then take that knowledge and be able to evaluate all trade-offs and make a decision. That's why this is a professional level thing. And those other things are more junior technician, not even engineering level. I kind of hope this helps.
All right, fantastic.
I kind of hope. So let's get back to the content. Give me a hashtag CCSP. So I know you're awake, alert, and oriented. And then we will get back to some of this fun. And for me, I love getting involved in cybersecurity. Networking and cybersecurity are the nearest techs to my heart. We all know I love cloud architecture. I love enterprise architecture. But for me, I love getting geeky with cybersecurity. So hashtag CCSP. Sorry about the clock. It was too loud. And let's go and have some fun. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of cloud computing environments and the strengths and weaknesses of each one, and why we're actually dealing with them. So we're going to begin with the private cloud. So what is a private cloud? They've existed for a very long time. So a private cloud is where you take a data center, you bring in your power, you bring in your cooling, you bring in, what do you call it? Your networking gear, your routers, your switches. You bring in your servers, your storage area networks. You connect your networking connections, and then you're done. You're done. And kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So there's that. Now, when we deal with the private data center, here's the thing to remember. If I have my servers, only my stuff is on these servers. Meaning, if my name is Cindy the Cat's Company, well, actually, let's use my real name, Go Cloud Careers. And only Go Cloud Career servers are actually running on our OpenStack Cloud. And we run an OpenStack Cloud at Go Cloud Careers. And here's the reason why. It was about $10,000 to set up the cloud ourselves. And it was $11,000 to rent it per month on a cloud provider. So over the course of 4 years, one option, including power, was $15,000. The cloud provider was close to $400,000. So, in our data center, we've got better performance, we've got greater security, and it's only my stuff that's on our servers. So there's that. So private cloud, you got to do a lot more work. We got a lot more planning that goes on here. We've got a lot more networking. We've got more sophisticated security, and we have to know how to do it. But in our world, the private cloud, I've got 2 CCIEs on staff, let alone some of the people I have. So it's much easier for us to build it for our systems. By the comparison, here's the public cloud that we're typically talking about. The public cloud is going to AWS, it's going to Azure, Cisco, Google, Dell's cloud, HP's cloud, Alibaba's cloud. It doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. I'm just renting space in their data center. This is a multi-tenancy model. So I want you to think about this. You are not the only people there. You are logically separated by hypervisors. You are logically separated via software, but it's not the same degree of separation you have in the data center. It's almost as good. So if someone was able to successfully execute a hypervisor attack in my data center, they could jump from a Go Cloud Careers machine to a Go Cloud Careers machine. In the cloud, they could go from a Go Cloud Careers machine to anybody else's systems if they could execute that hypervisor attack, for example. Of course, they'd have to do an IAM attack and other things at the same time. So public cloud, you rent space, it's there. Now, I want you to understand this. In my private data center, my private cloud, I can do anything I want security. I can say that Mark's traffic goes first, my traffic goes second, Cindy the cat's traffic goes third, and if there's congestion, nobody else's traffic goes. In my private data center, I can put two servers in the same VLAN and make them not even be able to talk to each other at layer 2, long before I've got firewalls, access lists, and IAM. I could provide preferential service to Mark. I could do anything I want on my data center. And the public cloud, I can't. The public cloud cannot offer this degree of networking security. And here's the reason why. They have to serve thousands and millions of customers, not just you. So we lose some of that with the public cloud. We've got low control. We have to assume the cloud provider does a good job and doesn't make mistakes. When Google deleted a $240 billion hedge fund by mistake, it was a pretty big mistake. So that can happen in the public cloud. The whole cloud can go down. In our data center, it's up to us. So, will the cloud be more likely to go down than a data center? It depends on how well the cloud's run, and it depends on how well the data center's run. But understand this. Public cloud is generally more expensive because they have to build the same stuff you do, and then they got to sell it, and they got to manage it, and they got to run it. And if I hadn't mentioned, we've got a completely free book for you guys. The link is in the description and the chat box. So go download the completely free book. It's over 400 pages. Our team wrote it to help you with the exam. Now let's talk about one of the really cool architectures. It's called the hybrid cloud. And here's why it's actually interesting. Highest performance is always achieved by your data center. Lowest cost is often achieved in your data center. But here's the problem with your data center. You run out of capacity. You run out of scalability, and it's not agile. So in a hybrid cloud, for example, if I have something that needs, 256 cores and 4 terabytes of RAM, this thing's going to cost me much less running it in my data center. And in the public cloud, I can put some other stuff that's more sporadic on demand. So with the private cloud, I get the highest performance. I potentially have the highest security for my things that matter most, and I can leverage the public cloud for its scalability and agility. This gives me the ability to maximize my cost and maximize my performance. And I can have everything running in my data center here, and all of a sudden we need more capacity. It goes over to the cloud. We pay to use it in the cloud. When we don't need it, it goes back to the data center. So hybrid clouds give us a lot. So remember, the private cloud is just us. Public cloud is just the data, like AWS, Azure, or Google. The hybrid cloud is a data center plus the cloud. Now, the next thing is multi-cloud. So how much percentage of the world is multi-cloud? 98% of all businesses, enterprise businesses. So everybody, which is why you can't learn just AWS and expect a job, or can't just learn Azure and expect a job. You have to know cloud. You wouldn't learn how to get certified driving a Toyota, would you? You'd learn how to drive a car. It's the same thing. So learn the underlying technology. So multi-cloud is when you use more than one clouds, and there's lots of reason to do it. If I put 50% of my stuff in AWS and 50% in Azure, if Azure has an outage, AWS still works and it can auto scale to full capacity, or vice versa. I might also say that, Microsoft's on the bleeding edge of AI, Google's on the bleeding edge of data, and AWS has the biggest infrastructure of anyone, and I might want to leverage the best of all three. I can also use multi-cloud for that. I can use it to eliminate single points of failure because the cloud providers themselves are a single point of failure, no matter how many data availability zones and region you use, because they share some things in common, like a control plane and a network. And even if they're segregated and they have different interior gateway protocols connected via BGP, it's still sharing a common network. So multi-cloud gets a little more complex. It's not that big of a deal for people like me that have been doing multi-data centers for the last 30 years. Pretty much the same thing. With multi-cloud, we just don't use any cloud provider proprietary stuff, which brings us into more industrial solutions anywhere. And here's what you're usually seeing. We're now typically seeing hybrid multi-clouds, where an organization has a data center, and they use more than one cloud. We've removed basically all single points of failure. We've added the ability to optimize our pricing, but we've increased our complexity substantially. Now, if we're going to be doing hybrid multi-cloud, we need the same kind of people that we would use if we had a data center, the data center grade of people, because now we're dealing with much, much, much more. And then we can talk about the community cloud. So we'll do that. You know what? I have an idea. There's been so many questions as it pertains to tech career stuff that we'll stop at 5 o'clock, our tech stuff. I will take 20 to 30 minutes of career questions and we'll call it at the end of that. And Mark and I will set up one day in the next 2 weeks to do 2 hours on Zoom. But I want to make sure, because a lot of these questions are popping in, I can answer as many as I can. So now let's talk about a community cloud. Now this is pretty cool. A community cloud is where you have several organizations build a cloud together and share it. And there was a question in the chat box about this. So maybe I have 3 universities. Philadelphia, for example, trains a quarter of the United States medical students in the country. So maybe in Philadelphia, they were to take Temple University and Penn State and Drexel University. Now, this is just an example, and make a single one and make a single cloud, and then they shared it with each other. That's a community cloud. It's not open to the general public, but it's shared among related organizations. So there are your typical types of environments. First thing we need to think about is multi-tenancy, meaning many, many people are using the same infrastructure. Many. So when we're dealing with the cloud provider has to provide the security. So the servers, we shouldn't actually be able to see the real servers, the hardware, the underlying things. We should not be able to, for example, be able to see the configurations on their underlying router. We should not be able to see if their underlying network is an OSPF network or an intermediate systems to intermediate systems network. We should not be able to see if they're using label switching or tag switching. We should not be able to see if they're signaling RSVP tunneling. We shouldn't be able to see their IBGP peering points, because if we do, we can hack into their systems. So I hope that makes sense. So if customer A is impacted by a data breach, hopefully, theoretically, it won't impact another customer, unless the cloud provider themselves is hacked, in which case then they could get access to, who knows, potentially all the customers in the cloud. And that's another risk. And that's why the cloud providers, people are always trying to hack them, because they're the highest value targets in the world. And look what happened when Microsoft's DynamoDB was compromised, for example. Access to thousands of clients' records were taken. It's not just Microsoft, believe me, but think about that. So now let's think of some of the complexities that go on with multi-tenancy. Oversubscription. So in a normal environment, I will only have a certain number of things that are available to me. Let me see if I can share something with you quickly. And I'll show you what I mean by oversubscription. And we must be concerned about oversubscription as it pertains in the real world. Let me see if I can see if this works. Bear with me a minute. I'm going to try and temporarily share something with you, if I can figure out how to do it. So this is so I just wanted to do this. It's one of these things that I just felt like in real time might be good for everyone. So here's what I mean by oversubscription. And this is something that will happen in a cloud provider. Can you guys, so in this particular environment, you can see my VMware screen. Now, I want you to look at this very carefully. See the server itself? It has 24 physical cores on here. And there's a reason I want you to see this. I'm highlighting it in blue right over here. 24 physical cores. And if I were to create, and what happens is these cores have something called hyperthreading, which enables these cores to split themselves into two logical cores. So now if I have this virtual machine and I were to create a virtual machine on this server, I'll name it Cindy the cat because I love my little cat. I adopted her, but I thought I rescued her, but who knows who rescued whom. Let's say I was going to put Linux over here, and let's say that I was going to use Ubuntu over here. And this is something you actually have to really understand in the cloud. Here's my amount of memory. Let's say, look at the number of CPU cores I have and can allocate on it. I can allocate 48, which is twice as many as I actually have because of hyperthreading. But in an oversubscription environment, let's say I make this virtual machine 24 cores, and I give this virtual machine, say, 16 gigabytes of DRAM. I can also create another virtual machine and another virtual machine, and potentially I can create 3 virtual machines with 24 cores. In fact, let me turn on this one so you can see it. I intentionally didn't install an operating system, or I'm not going to, but while we're at it, let me go create another virtual machine. Bear with me. Okay, let me go back to the host. Now I'm going to create another 24-core virtual machine. And you have to understand that all cloud providers do this. And this is one of the ways they make money, is they sell more capacity than they actually have. So now in this typical virtual machine, we'll change this to 16. We'll change this back to gigs. I'm going to allocate 24 more cores here. Start. Let's get the host device. Let's make sure it's a data. Let's make sure it's something like this. Next. Finish. Let's turn this virtual machine on. Virtual machines. So we have Cindy 2. Let's turn it on. And I'm going to explain to you why this is going to technically work. But it's something you need to be very concerned about in the cloud provider. Now I'm going to create a third virtual machine. I'll call it Cindy 3. Make it Ubuntu as well. Linux, and we're going to explain why this is going to allow me to happen. And over here, let's give it 24 more CPU cores. Now, mind you, I only have 24 cores in the server. I want that to be very clear. I've got 24, but I've just allocated 3 machines. And each of these 3 machines is now booting up. So I've allocated 72 cores when I only have 24. You can see all these virtual machines are running. Now let me turn on the third virtual machine. So Cindy 3. Failed to power on. Okay, well, my settings didn't let me, but typically speaking, you can do this. So why is this allowing this as a general rule? Well, what ultimately is going on here is the following. Most people don't use 100% of their capacity of their virtual machines at the same time, or the network at the same time. So what they're doing is they're selling more than they actually have. And that works great until everybody uses it all at the same time. And if they use it all at the same time, that's when you get the burstiness of cloud computing, where instead of in the data center, it's smooth because you don't oversubscribe your own systems. Service providers tend to oversubscribe them. So because they're pulling memory and they're pulling CPUs in order to make money and turn a profit, they generally have to oversubscribe. So as long as not everybody is using it, you don't have a problem. Is this unique to cloud computing? Not at all. How many of you, for example, were home during COVID and all of a sudden your internet service provider got real slow, real fast? It's because they oversubscribe too, typically 10 to 1. And they sell 10 times more capacity they have on the basis that most people don't use it at the same time to their fullest capacity. So understand in this multi-tenancy environment, you run that risk. So your performance in cloud computing may be much more bursty, waiting for your test to be scheduled on the CPUs, for example. So that's going to be something you're going to have to plan ahead. Now, in the realm of cloud computing, we're going to have a lot of roles and responsibilities assigned to both individuals and organizations. The primary roles in cloud computing are the cloud service provider and the customer. The cloud service provider is the cloud provider. So they're the business that's offering the cloud computing services. Their responsibility is building and maintaining their service offerings, making sure their network infrastructure, their server infrastructure, their security infrastructure kind of works. Securing their infrastructure from a cybersecurity perspective, from a physical security perspective. That's why you can't knock on the door of your cloud provider and walk right in, because if you can plug into their systems, there's all kinds of damage that you can do. So that's the responsibility of them. Now you, as the customer, are responsible for securing your stuff, your virtual machines, your data, your everything. And that's where we come into this wacky concept of the shared responsibility model. They maintain their underlying infrastructure and you maintain your stuff. And if you can always think about it about your stuff versus their stuff, my mother-in-law likes the word stuff, but so it picked up on me. But if you can always think of who's yours, who's hers, theirs, that's going to give you everything you need to know. So your virtual machine, your stuff, you patch it, you reduce unnecessary services, determine whatever host point protection you're putting, like IDS, host-based IDS, IPS, host-based anti-malware, host-based firewall, that kind of thing. You're responsible for securing that VM. They're responsible for securing the hypervisor and that server and the server's attachments to the networks, for example. So there's this dynamic between you and the provider, and you'll be able to interact with the provider a little bit, but not enough. You're not going to be able to walk into that cloud providers and see their systems and check them out and penetration test them yourself. And then we'll go through that along the way with what even testing you can even do with your systems on the cloud versus your data center, but that's something else. You'll typically have a dedicated account rep, which will be your sales rep that will manage your relationship. But most of it is self-service, unless you were going to deal with the cloud provider and basically you had them design your thing, implement thing, and maintain it. And that's why a lot of people deal with Accenture, Deloitte, KPMG, Capgemini, IBM, big systems integrators, because not only will they come in and help design it, but they'll go build it and then operate it for you if you want in an outsourcing type model. Now, a little bit of cybersecurity thing with regards to cloud access security brokers. So we may be dealing with businesses called cloud access security brokers, and what they do is they manage various identity platforms, and we can use that to determine who users are and whether we want to trust them or not. And that feeds into the identity and access management, otherwise known as authentication, authorization, and accounting, where authentication is me claiming that Mark is who he says he is. Authorization is determining what Mark's allowed to. And the accounting side of IAM is determining what Mark has actually done. So kind of hope these things kind of make sense. Now, as we're dealing with us and our company, say Go Cloud Careers, and now we're dealing with the cloud provider where we host our stuff, that's not enough. Now we've got regulators that are going to be regulating us. So in my youth, when I was doing internal medicine, practicing internal medicine, I'm a nurse practitioner, I had all kinds of regulations. We had regulations from the Joint Commission of Healthcare Accreditation for the hospital. We had HIPAA regulations related to some of the information that I can actually do. So kind of think about and keep these things to the back of your mind. So there's that. And you want to keep that in the back of your mind. So there is this. I mentioned that shared security model. And, here's the thing, and I see at the box in the chat box, there are many cloud service providers that are short capacity in various regions in the world. And there's lots of times on the cloud where we run into this bursty cloud nature. We shouldn't, but the statistics of running these kind of data centers and shared data centers just happen. The key thing what we're dealing with in these data centers and these cloud providers is virtualization. That's the underlying technology. So how old are shared networks? Well, they're 40 or 50 years old. So the first virtualization, which is the enabling factor of all clouds, is as follows. It was IBM. So IBM had these mainframes. You thought it looked like mainframes were going to die 20 years ago. They didn't. Mainframe spending is going up. And mainframe spending in many cases actually competes with cloud computing, specifically for banks and high transaction workloads. They do it very efficiently. Something to think about in the back of your mind. So it started out with around the 1970s with IBM time sharing mainframes. The next thing happened was in 1999, VMware actually invented the first hypervisor for x86 architectures. And that's kind of been the driving factor for first virtual server virtualization. Now the cloud providers, now hypervisors have changed over time. Linux used to have had QEMU, now has KVM. We also have the Windows has its own hypervisor. The cloud providers are making their own, but they're all based on the same kind of concept. Windows has Hyper-V. I think it's Windows has Hyper-V. Citrix has Zen. Lots of different hypervisors that you can work with. So that's when the start of virtualization was. The virtual machine started being virtualized in 1999. We did network virtualization much before this. You can think of VLANs, for example, as a virtualized network. And prior to that, we had some other things. Frame relay networks, ATM networks, all virtual systems and network inside of a system. So those kind of things, switch networks. So why did this happen? What's going on? Why all this virtualization now? So when I started my career, a server had one CPU core per core, and maybe we had 2 CPUs in the server. And maybe these CPUs, if we were lucky, were a couple hundred megahertz, and when I started, it was less than that. We had 200 megahertz CPUs in a server. We had a couple megs of RAM, which was, tens of thousands of dollars. We had our 5 hard drives in RAID that were sitting inside this server, and it could maybe do, on a good day, email. And that's all that server could do. And then Intel started putting more cores on more servers with a multi-core, and then AMD advanced server processors, so much more, specifically in the last 5 years. And the newest processors from AMD, which are coming out, have 192 cores. And we can put 2 of them in a system. So think 384 physical cores, 764 virtual cores. Now, how many systems can I put on that server that each have 8 cores and maybe 64 gigs of DRAM? 384 divided by 8, or actually 768 divided by 8. That's how many servers we can pop here. So now servers got pretty big, they got pretty beefy, and we needed to virtualize them. And let's think about the benefit. Now I could have 100 servers on a single physical server. Now in this virtualized server, I could have a little image or a little file that I can drag to another server and move that server like nothing. Now, instead of powering racks full of servers, I've got one server that might use 1,500 watts. So I'm saving space, I'm saving power, and with that comes cooling. Because if you want to calculate the cooling needs for a data center, well, you got to look at the number of watts used, and you can calculate BTU's number of cooling that's amount of needed. So less power, less cooling, less temperature, less heat. Systems run longer, they don't cost as much, and they're more stable. So kind of hope that makes sense why we went to virtualization. Now, when we come to virtualization, we're going to have 2 options here. Option 1 is a hypervisor like I just showed you. It's called a type 1 hypervisor. And let's talk about what makes a type 1 hypervisor a type 1 hypervisor. So you saw on my VMware environment that I had this Dell server. This is the actual server itself. And you could see I had this concept of, I had VMware, which was the hypervisor I was using. So I had this hypervisor, VMware, ESXi, that was my hypervisor. And what we were doing is we were creating a virtual machine. So this virtual machine would have the OS. It would have the applications dependencies. And then it would have the actual application. This is a traditional virtual machine, the way it would work. And I'll have many of these virtual machines all sitting on the server. They can have any operating system I want. One could be Windows, one could be Linux, one could be Red Hat, one could be Ubuntu, what have you. This over here that I'm showing you, This is a type 1 hypervisor. This is how industrial hypervisors are done, server virtualization. This is what you see in the cloud. Now, this is going to be a little different than this. This is a type 2 hypervisor where instead of having the VMware, let's say this is your Dell PC. It went from a Dell server to a Dell PC. Now you've got your operating system. Let's say you've got Windows 11 here. And then now you installed a hypervisor application. Say maybe you installed VMware Workstation, so hypervisor. And then you've got your virtual machines. This is the secret to why server virtualization is much better, type 1 hypervisors versus type 2. And this is a type 2. We have to run the hypervisor after the operating system. So the hypervisor is less speaking directly to the hardware and is speaking to a degree to the operating system, which causes the performance of this type 2 hypervisor that we might be using on a desktop PC or a notebook to perform nowhere near as well as that type 1 hypervisor where we had Dell server, we had the VMware ESXi, and we had our virtual machines. Kind of hope that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about virtualization security. It's that hypervisor itself that's isolating virtual machine 1 from virtual machine 2, from virtual machine 3 to virtual machine 4. Now, one of the concerns that we have in cybersecurity is that someone can basically perform a virtual machine escape where they break out of their operating system into another guest operating system, which can happen. So we have to trust that our cloud providers are securing their systems, their hypervisors, they're patching any weaknesses as they occur. So kind of hope that makes sense to you. We also want to be concerned about something called virtual machine sprawl. So we're dealing, and this means in the data center, private cloud, public cloud. And what am I talking about? We could be creating virtual machines for a whole bunch of uses, and we might actually forget we have them. Did you notice? And I intentionally did this. When I went to my VMware server and I started 2 Linux systems, that I didn't shut them off because I was going to talk about virtual machine sprawl. And virtual machine sprawl is businesses, they find virtual machines, they have them, they start them, they don't stop them, they leave them, they create them. And over time, they can be creating a whole bunch of things that are draining resources from their system. And not only draining resources from their system, every system that you have that's got an IP address on it can be hacked. So keep that in the back of your mind. I want to discuss the concept of the CIA triad. So I don't care anybody's certification exam, you're going to see this. So one of our foundational security concepts we need to talk about is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And that's going to be referred to as your CIA triad. Confidentiality, which I'll talk much more about in a minute, is about making sure that Cindy the cat's medical records can't be seen by anyone. It's about making sure that the prescription I wrote and e-prescribed for someone didn't get changed along the way, the integrity of that data. So if I have a patient that's having active chest pain and a heart attack, and I start an IV on them and I give them a nitro sublingual and I give them 2 milligrams of IV morphine, that's okay. But what would happen if a hacker took the order that was in the chart for the 2 milligrams of morphine and changed it to 200 milligrams of IV morphine? The patient would overdose and die. So that's why we have to maintain the integrity of our information. Now, the availability is our systems being there when they're needed. So, for example, have we seen examples of companies that have gotten hacked and all of a sudden you can't access their website? A whole lot. So, confidentiality, data protection, making sure nobody can see it. Integrity, making sure things didn't change. And availability, meaning systems are there and available when we need them. So now I can dive deeper on each one. Confidentiality is all about the secrecy of your data or your objects if it's an object storage or your resources. Here's the key. We want to make sure that only the people that need access to the knowledge can access it and nobody else can. We're trying to prevent that unauthorized access. Confidentiality protections aim to prevent information disclosure. So I just got a letter that said, you and 100 million people, our medical records were hacked. Okay. Are my records confidential? No, because some hacker got me and 100 million people from the United Healthcare hack. Think about that. And while United Healthcare was hacked this year, or was it last year? I can't remember. The doctors and hospitals couldn't authorize procedures. So medical work wasn't being done. So lots of challenges happened with that hacking event. So we have to think of what can cause a violation of confidentiality. It's not solely directed at intentional attacks. It can be a lot of things. So I got Billy Bob in my office. Billy Bob takes a photo, screenshot, and somehow emails it to someone. It's a human error, potentially. Or Billy Bob logs into his computer and gets a phone call from his girlfriend, leaves his computer open in the middle of a crowded airport. That is human error or oversight or ineptitude. You'll see this kind of stuff all day long. A lot of times it's going to be because people don't know what they're doing. So one of the biggest challenges I have when I hire people in technology is I can find 1,000,001 people that can configure anything, but they don't know what they're configuring or why they're configuring it or what's going on. So the data on cloud security events is scary. I mean, it's terrifying. And last week, Chris can provide a link to this discussion we had where we went over some of the cybersecurity things in the cloud, and it is terrifying. Maybe my team will provide a link to that discussion, which is why we made this. So lots of things can happen with regards to confidentiality. What if I told you that 16% of all cloud security breaches are related to misconfigured AWS S3 buckets? Because people didn't even understand how they were putting something in object storage. So could be a mistake that an admin does. Someone could set up them public when it needs to be private. It could be a misconfiguration. Often it is. It could be a misaligned policy. It could be anything. So when we talk about information confidentiality, we have to talk about a few concepts. So one is sensitivity. Is it any secret that I like to drink a lot of water? Every time you see me with a cup of water and every time you see me with some bottle of alkaline water somewhere. So it's no secret that I like drinking water. No big deal. Is that sensitive information? Not at all. People know I like water. So what? I don't care if anybody knows. But there is information that's sensitive. What about the patient that came into my office? It just found out he is responsible for another baby outside his wife. Now, I got to tell you, that's got all kinds of legal liabilities all over that if the healthcare provider lets that information slip. Or what if a financial advisor accidentally discloses a customer's financial holdings and they're in an environment where that could affect their building? So the sensitivity of the data we have to think about with regards to confidentiality. And that really is the degree of harm that can actually occur to an individual or business should that information be leaked. The next thing we need to think about is discretion. And discretion, it allows an operator to either influence or control disclosure. So many of you are going to get great careers. Many of you will become principal architects, distinguished architects, and that's where I was 2 years into my career, and it just went up from there. When you are a distinguished architect or a principal architect, here's what's going to happen. The company you work for is going to give you sensitive information on the trust that you have the discretion not to disclose it. And if you work for a cloud provider as a distinguished architect, you're going to know new features that are going to be coming out and where the delays are and the weaknesses inside of the various parts of the system. And you can't disclose that to the public world. That's trade secret. So under certain roles, you'll be treated with the discretion that you have the ability to control what information you have. And as you move up in your career, especially in security, you'll have, and any career in architecture, you'll have access to more and more information. That information will be about a critical business process, maybe any kind of thing that's necessary for that business to run. And if that gets out, that business could be put out of business by its competitors because it can lose its secret sauce or proprietary processes or what have you. The next thing we need to think about in confidentiality, which is going to determine how we protect it, how critical is the information? For example, how critical is it for you to find out that I like cats? I mean, there's a cat of me everywhere, and you're always hearing about my cat. My cat's drone runner across a YouTube video. It's no big deal to assume I like cats. But anybody see the commercial for Bush's Baked Beans where you got the golden retriever that's trying to sell the secret formula? Anyway, if you're in America or you've seen that commercial, we've got this fluffy golden retriever that's trying to sell the secret formula for baked beans from its owner. That owner would consider that pretty critical information. I don't know what the dog needs money for, but whatever, the dog's trying to sell it. So that could be an issue. The secret formula for a brand new drug. How about the architecture for NVIDIA's next, maybe the H300, because the H200 and 100s are now out. Think about that. We have to think about that as we plan our security. Regarding secrecy, so we have to. So when it comes to keeping information confidential, what can we do? We can conceal it, right? So can we hide it? Yeah, we can hide it. All kinds of ways we can hide it. For example, I had a patient when I used to practice internal medicine that couldn't lose weight. And the patient's wife said, check my husband's pockets. I'm pretty sure he's got a couple of candy bars in there. And he opened up his pockets and he had a bunch of candy bars. He was concealing them. So we can basically conceal information. How might we do that? We might basically obfuscate it or make it really hard to understand. We may create something that's a distraction along the way or a cover. We might create some kind of security through obscurity, whether we hide it in plain sight or whether we do something with it. So concealment, we can hide it. Secrecy. We may take information and just keep it secret. Lots of things require secret information. And privacy. It's keeping personally identifiable information confidential. And here what we're doing is we're trying to prevent the disclosure of information that can cause harm or embarrassment. So other things we can do is we can use something called seclusion, where we might have something and store it in an out-of-way location. Any of you have dogs that basically bury bones in various different places? Or have you ever met someone that hides stuff in various places? That's seclusion. Another way we can promote confidentiality is something called isolation, in that we can just keep it separate from everything else. In order to get access to this information, you have to come to my private island. The private island has a 500-foot wall surrounding the private island. On top of the private island are ex-Marine recon snipers that are sitting on top of the private on that wall. Behind the wall, I've got a moat, and it's filled with alligators, sharks, crocodiles, and a bunch of scary things. You know, that's a great way to keep it isolated and nobody's going to find it. I'm not recommending this, but you get the point. When it comes to security, we can use any option we actually want. Now let's talk about integrity. So integrity is about making sure that our data hasn't been changed. So imagine you deposit $2,000 in the bank and then you write out a check for $1,500 to someone, but somebody pulled out $20,000 from your bank account. That'd be a problem, right? Or what if you wrote someone a check for $2,000 and someone changed it to $200,000? You wouldn't be too happy when that came out of your bank account. So that's the point of integrity. Or a patient's dosage gets changed and a person dies. Or the person goes to buy 10 shares of NVIDIA stock In the end, buys 10,000 shares, and it goes through every last dollar they had, all their financing could get. Integrity matters. So that's why we have to protect integrity. Nobody wants their checking account balance brought to zero. And how do we maintain integrity? Well, we keep information confidential, and we keep it protected, and we keep it secure, and we don't let people have access to it. So when it comes to accessing things, we have to be really thinking about it. There's a lot of ways to control access. This is very, very important. There's a lot of ways to control access. And guess what? It's more than IAM. For example, if I can keep you firewalled off so you can't access my network, it doesn't matter. You can't access it. If after my firewall, I've got an access list, you can't reach it. If you breach my firewall and my access list, but you don't have a route to it and a route back in my data center, you can't access it. So my data has its integrity. So there's a lot that goes into these things. Integrity is having the completeness of the data, the comprehensiveness of the data, and all necessary elements within the scope of what we have. So that's realistically speaking what we're talking about with regards to integrity. And I'll end after we talk about, the basics of availability, and then we'll go into questions. So availability refers to the systems being available when needed. And there is a tremendous amount that goes into high availability system designs. It's far more than use 2 clouds and 2 availability two availability zones, which is 2 data centers and 2 clouds. That's nowhere close to enough to design a high availability system. It's going to mean there's no single points of failure in your system design, in your wide area networks, in your cloud to cloud systems, in your routers, in your firewalls, in your security, in your change control processes and procedures. A lot goes into it. Because one reboot of a wrong router in the wrong place can take your systems down for 2 or 3 minutes, depending upon how they're at. They shouldn't, but it can happen. And especially if you've got a bunch of routers with high CPUs and one router crashes and reboots, and you didn't have this network isolated, it could take down the systems for minutes. So these kind of things happen. So when we're dealing with availability, it's about making sure that we've got good system controls in place, tight change management, very good security, because if we're hacked, we don't have access to our systems. So when we deal with availability, it's going to be highly dependent upon the integrity of our systems, the confidentiality of our data, and all the systems work. Because without integrity and confidentiality, we can't maintain our systems and keep them up and running. So when we talk about availability, we have a couple of things we should think about. We have usability. So if your systems are part of your systems go down, but they're up to a point where you click a button and then 15 minutes later, another screen comes up and then you get a 404 error or a 303 error, that's not an available system. So the usability, meaning the system comes up and it's actually working, again, you're dealing with the same kind of thing. Accessibility. Accessibility is about being able to access it. So in a high availability system, not only does we have to be able to access it, but it has to work with some degree of function. And we have to have some degree of performance with regards to what we're actually dealing with. So before I get into maintenance, I think tomorrow we'll start with maintenance and version control. Let's answer 10 minutes about the actual content. And then where there's some career questions, which I will stay 30 minutes after the thing ends, which is at 5 p.m., and answer any career questions that I can for up to 30 minutes. I can't go more than 30 minutes, but I can do 30 minutes.
All right, fantastic. Let's take a look at what questions we have queued up for you, Mike. Here, let's take a look.
Okay.
From Scooby Dow, could you utilize GPUs for high kyber? So And then it says, would high kyber be better in private or public? I already answered it to a certain extent for Scooby. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Scooby Dow. When it comes to what he's necessarily discussing, the kyber, which is going to be a key exchange mechanism. So this is going to be a post-quantum encryption, and it's going to be an encapsulation. And generally speaking, what he's referring to is going to be GPU acceleration based on NVIDIA RTX, kind of like if you think about what the AI chips are using. Would it be in private or public better? Depends on where you're going to be using that type of key exchange mechanism. Now, or encapsulation mechanism. What I would tell you, Scooby, is that this is such a new idea. And since it's post-quantum encryption, that you're probably going to find its first true usage, most likely within the private data centers. That's where it's going to get used at first. And then the people that are going to have some type of private infrastructure, and this could both be your data center, or if you think of it like an exclusive type of infrastructure, let's say the United States government, when they made a deal with AWS, they're being managed by AWS, but it's a private cloud for them because nobody else has access to that type of infrastructure. Those would be use cases or type of business drivers or use cases that would use this type of actual post-quantum encryption mechanism. And as a matter of fact, if you guys give me 1 second, if you all are truly interested in this, let me see if I can find it. I think it's NIST. Let me see if I remember. NIST FIPS 203. Let me take a look and see if that's the correct one. Yep. All right. I'm going to post a link in the chat for those that are interested. This comes direct from the National Information Technology Laboratory, which is basically a national standard within the United States. So this is going to be dealing with these type of key encapsulation methods. So if you're welcome, you can go read that and get all geeky in regards to how these different key encapsulation mechanisms work. All right.
Thanks,
Next
Mark.
question is from Roger Skorbinski. He's asking if your data center provides cloud services to multiple customers on shared infrastructure, it would be considered a public cloud or private cloud.
That's where you're either going to be a public cloud or a community cloud based upon who you're serving. So, for example, if you were serving just hospital systems in Philadelphia, and there's a lot of them, whether it be Temple University, Jefferson Hospital, I don't know what they're called anymore. For example, you've got Penn, you've got Presbyterian, which is now Penn, for example, and you were providing for all these organizations, that would be a community cloud. By comparison, if you were providing it for just a whole bunch of different businesses, then it would be a public cloud.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to it, because I did add to Roger, the nice thing that you can imagine here is the difference between private and public. Private is exclusive infrastructure. Think of it that way. So then you don't have to worry about, am I dealing with a third party that manages my cloud, which is going to be your data center? Am I managing or is somebody else managing? So think of it exclusivity in infrastructure. That's going to make the difference in regards to public or private. And what I'm also going to do for those that are eventually going to be sitting or want to have it as a reference, the IC Square uses a lot of definitions that are going to be found by the NIST glossary. So I'm going to put a link in there as well so that you can use that as think of it like an addendum to the actual study guide that we provided in case you need some additional clarification in regards to the different definitions and key terms that you'll get on the exam itself. All right, next question is from Daniel. He's asking, since the CCSP is mainly focused on the planning side of security rather than the technical part of security, does this limit our technical skills?
So, Daniel, I want you to hear from both me and Mark. The hard part is knowing what to do and when to do it. The easy part is the how to. So I want to make it kind of clear. There's a reason the CCIE has a 90% failure rate. That despite 50 or 60 people trying to take it every day, actually maybe 100 people taking it every day, after 30 years, there's only been 60,000 people. And they give you the instructions on how to configure something. Here's the reason why. It's very hard to find someone that understands the underlying technology, when to use the technology and how it works. That is what professionals do. The easy part is for me to go to ChatGPT or Claude 3.5 and ask it, provide the Cisco BGP configuration to configure router 1 in autonomous system 65312 to pair with router on autonomous system 65313. Provide the configuration to advertise the subnet 10.0.0.0/16. That's nothing. Now, knowing why I need BGP, what my BGP policy is, how I should engineer my traffic to prefer one link over another link, that's planning. That's the architect piece. And honestly, that's the high-end engineering piece. So if your goal is to be an admin, then it's all about getting hands-on. And click, 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 click here and try this and click this. And you're welcome to do that. If your goal is to be an engineer, then you need to know how to build it, and you need to know how to actually design it, and you need to know how to performance tune it and how the technology works. Now, if you want to be an architect, you are never going to touch the technology in your life. You won't be allowed. You'll be building business cases and quantify security things and determining an end-to-end security, an organization's end-to-end security needs and their end-to-end encryption needs, and what kind of training needs they have related to their people against cybersecurity uses, anti-phishing, anti-malware, anti-social engineering campaigns. So it depends on your job. But the most of the job is all the work over here, and it has the least of over to here. So the more technical you get, you find a distinguished engineer, they don't touch tech. They're advising tech and planning tech. So what we're talking about is planning. Now, I will tell you, it is really hard to hire someone, and here's why. If I ask someone what goes into designing the demilitarized zone for my web app, like, I'm not going to get an answer from anybody that's real. I mean, if I answer that to 1,000 people, on 995 can't answer it. And I can't hire any of them. None of them. Not a single one. They may know how to configure the Palo Alto firewall or the Checkpoint firewall or the Cisco firewall, but if all they know is how to configure it, I have no use to them in my organization. And here's the reason why. They only know how to click stuff, but they don't know what to click and why to click. That's the person that's going to cause me to have a security breach. That's the person that's going to make a mistake because they don't know why they're doing something, and it's going to cost me billions of dollars. That's the thing that's going to get my company sued when my data is breached. I don't need them on my team. I need people that can understand it. I need people that can think it through. And on the architect side, I need business experts that understand business and the impact of the technology on the business. In my engineering side, I need people that really get it, that understand all the depth of how this stuff has worked and how it's planned. Because anybody that knows what's planned can pick up any configuration guide and configure it. That's easy. Manufacturers tell you, click this, add this, add this. It's nothing. The real challenge is the what and the why. Now, Mark's got much more of an engineering background. Admittedly, I've been an architect for 25 years. But I'll let Mark add a little to that.
So does this limit our technical skills? But to a certain extent, it does. And that's only because you can only keep in mind so much details when it comes to the technical aspects when you have to keep track of the business drivers. And what I mean with that is if you're being given a call, let's say you're sitting on the call, the sales just brought somebody in, let's call it you've gotten an opportunity. It is your responsibility there, generally speaking, you're going to be some type of architect. It doesn't matter if it's a solution architect or if you're going to be called a cloud architect, whichever it might be. It is your job at that point not to figure out how am I going to configure a DMVPN solution from Cisco? Do I have to worry about if I'm going to use OSPF, BGP, or ERGRP to accomplish what I'm doing? Do I have to think about the two different phases when it comes to IPsec implementation? None of that matters. Now, will it be beneficial for you to know as you're talking to the customer what encryption is, meaning this confidentiality part of the CIA triad? Well, yeah, of course, because if the customer you're talking to tells you, I'm looking to secure and keep my information private, guess what? You will have to know the basics, at least, of what encryption is and what are some encryption options, especially when it comes to compliance and governance. That will be needed. So yes, there are certain limitations on how far you will extend your implementation skills, those technical skills, when you're being an architect, or if you're thinking about the CCSP or the CISSP. That's just a given fact. You're not going to get around that. But that will not make you less valuable because your value rises now in what type of business you can drive towards and what type of solutions you can bring to the business to make them more efficient. Yeah. We use this idea of becoming or driving digital transformation. this is more than simply understanding how do I implement technology. It has to do with what is the technology, why would I use the technology, meaning the circumstances I would be using it, and how does the technology work, not
Yes.
how do I implement it.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah. All right, let's go into the next question from Paul Johnson. He says, I've heard that the best combination of certifications are the CCNP, the OSCP, the CISSP, the CCSP to get a diverse enough background to be a security architect. Is this wrong?
Paul, that will teach you 30% of what you need to know. Now, the OSCP is an engineering thing, and engineering and architecture have nothing to do with each other. And one of the ways people damage their careers when they want to become architects is they learn engineering. Now, why is that damaging their career? Because it's changing the way they think and it's changing what they're learning. So if you want to be a physician, if you think going to school to be a nurse, for example, for 4 years is going to make you a better doctor, it won't. Go to medical school and start there. Now, the OSCP is about breaking into systems. That's not going to help you as an architect. So the CCNP, again, is a how-to certification in networking. Now, understanding of networking is going to be helpful, but you're not going to get enough of a knowledge of networking by just the CCNP. Let me show you something. You need to understand the IP protocol. This book over here, this pretty thick book, this TCP/IP Illustrated, volume 1 is just IP. Now, this whole book is about how ARP works and how this works and how that works, and it doesn't even come close to the how-to. Now, there's 2 versions of this just for IP. Now, you need to know that. Now, you'll also need to understand the routing protocols and how to secure them. And quite frankly, in the CCNP, they barely scratched the surface of it. So if I got rid of the CCNP, but made you learn much more networking that you really need to learn, got rid of the security, the hacking thing, because that has nothing to do with what you're going to do on architect, and the CISSP and the CCSP, now you've got about 25 to 30% of what you need to know. Now you're going to have to know how to go build the business case. You're going to have to know how to lead an architecture team. You're going to have to know how to lead the engineers through a proof of concept testing. You're an architect. You're going to be doing a lot of knowledge sharing. You're going to be presenting at conferences. You're going to be looking at an organization and their application portfolios. You're going to be looking for opportunities for security. You're going to be conducting training as an architect. You're going to have to understand system designs and all these underlying technologies. So there's a reason when we train cloud security architects in our cloud architect career development program, the CISSP is a percentage of it, but it's much more presentation, much more sales, much more executive, much more leadership, and it takes time. So, people think we architects are going to touch the test, but no, we'll be looking at interoperability analysis, and we'll be designing enterprise-wide security architectures, and be looking for ways to remove technical debt and create architectural assessments from both business processes and technology things, and establishing standards and establishing frameworks and optimizing resource allocation and evaluating and technology platforms after looking at the trade-offs and see how they fit in. So you're going to need architecture training in addition to that. So I kind of hope that actually makes less sense. So Mark, maybe add a little bit, then we teach all that, but understand that a certification is part of it, and architecture is a lot of business things. So why don't you address that, Mark?
Okay. So you mentioned to give you the diverse enough background. So the diversity piece is true. You got the CCNP, you got the OSCP. Those are going to be geared towards implementation.
Yes.
And the other one is going to be built towards, think of it more like a kind of white hat, kind of like blue team type of hacking idea, right? So that penetration testing, that's the OSCP.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the CCNP, it doesn't matter if you go for the score, if you go for the SVPN, it doesn't matter which certification you go for. The training from Cisco is pretty good in teaching you the actual technology. Okay,
Yeah.
so you're going to learn how does VPNs actually work, and they're all different types, including some of the VPNs that you're going to be like, what the heck is get VPN, right? You're going to have to learn that when you do these things. But understand this is the difference between the first 2 you mentioned and then the CISSP and the CCSP.
Yep.
It's the mindset. If you can juggle the mindset, one being that you're going to focus on how do I make the technology work compared to why am I using the technology, and what is the business outcome that the technology is supposed to accomplish. If you can somehow balance that, which from my experience is very difficult, you can do both. It will give you something. But I'm going to tell you this. Neither of these things, and even though the CSSP and the CCSP touch briefly on it, none of them are going to give you some of the wealth of knowledge you'll need in regards to the security architecture frameworks. There you want to think of like SASBAS. That's an enterprise security architecture. You want to think about the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? It gives you a holistic view of cybersecurity. And then something that's being driven quite forward is the zero trust architecture. None of these different architectures are actually really covered in any depth when it comes to any of these certifications. You'll need to have an understanding of them to become a lot more well-rounded and to actually be a security architect. Let me know, Paul, if that addresses your concern around them. It's not about a right way or a wrong way. It's rather if can you balance the two different mindsets. All right, let's take a look at our next question. So this is from Lanre. They're asking, can you provide a roadmap for someone aiming at becoming a cloud security architect?
Yes. And I'm going to have a complete webinar on Thursday on how to be a cloud security architect. But here's the thing. If you train to be a cloud security architect, that will be your first job. So why do I say this? Because people have it in their mind that if they're going to learn how to do somebody else's job like an engineer, they're not going to be an architect, but they won't. So if I say Jermaine Houston sold landscaping gear before his first job as a cloud architect after our training, I'm sorry, enterprise architect, or Balwinder Kerr was a stay-at-home mom before Microsoft hired her directly as a cloud solutions architect, or Daniel Bosu was a 20-year-old who got hired by JP Morgan Chase as an architect after our training, or Jordan Kitku, who was a college student hired by AWS as a solutions architect after our training. There's a reason I'm telling you this. Or Al Legister, whose first job was at Deloitte after our training as a senior solutions architect, and his last job was a sales rep for Kimberly-Clark selling consumer products. Or Lenny Burnett was a video editor who got his first tech job at Citrix as a solutions architect. Or Richard Ferrara, who worked in a bank's fraud department, not in security and not in tech, but in the regular security, who got hired as a security architect after our training. Or Ivan Tamba, who was a 24-year-old college student whose first job was a solutions architect at AWS. Or Wallace Agana from Ghana, whose first job was an enterprise architect at JP Morgan Chase Bank. Or Vladimir F., who got hired as a solutions architect as his first tech job. There is no roadmap. The roadmap is the career you train for, is the career you receive. Now, we spend 1,000 hours training somebody to be an architect and about 20 hours of training to pass the AWS Solutions Architect Professional. So you have to have all the skills. You have to. But there is no such thing as a roadmap. The job you get is the job you train for. Train to be an airplane pilot, you fly the plane. Train to be the flight attendant, and guess what? You're going to be the flight attendant. Now, the flight attendants are very valuable, important people that keep the passengers safe on the plane. No less important. But the skill you train for is the job you get. That's where people make a mistake.
All right, great. Let's take a look at our next question, please.
And we're in the bonus career answering time. But Mark and I will find a time on Zoom. And for these architect questions, join us on Thursday's webinar on Zoom. We'll cover every aspect of the role, skills you need. It's going to be a fun time. And it's free. And you can ask any questions you want live.
All right, looks like we got a two-parter from Noble here, Mike. He says, hello, Mike. I always love your content. Your experience is really telling. So if I'm interested in the cloud security architect, wouldn't you suggest maybe getting a job where you can have some level of hands-on experience and then upskill to become an architect? I will appreciate some cert recommendations as well if you can give.
So, Noble, I think that's the worst thing you can do. So what you're really asking me is this, and I want you to understand the difference between the engineer and the architect, and I'll cover it in a minute. You're actually asking me, if I want to become an attorney, do you think I should go to medical school and be an internal medicine physician for a few years first? And why is that? Because engineering and architecture are so different. Architecture is about designing a system to optimize business performance, and engineering is all about the technology. So Noble, 70 to 80% of technology projects fail because they are tech-driven and they need to be business-driven. And a lot of that comes from people that were hands-on engineers first. Now, I love hands-on engineers. We need them to build stuff. But let me show you something. And I want you to see the difference between architect thinking versus engineering thinking. And then after that, I may bring in my favorite photo to do it. But I first want to start with an engineering thing. So here I actually typed some network engineering commands. I typed router BGP 65312, which is something an engineer would do. I picked the neighbor, which I actually have to put the IP address of the neighbor here. I must have cut and pasted it out. So let me add it. I was writing commands while I was here. And then I told the neighbor to activate, and then I don't know how I must have cut and pasted it off. Mask 255.255. Oops. 255.255.0.0. So over here, let's say I put this on a Cisco router, and I put it on a router in Japan to connect to the Japanese ISP NTT, and I use private eye things. Now, right now, Noble, I just put in a couple of commands. This is that hands-on engineering that we're talking about. Now, Noble, when I popped this onto a router in Japan, you know what happened? 900,000 routes just came into my system. Now, if I pop this on a router connecting to an NTT router in Japan, and I pop this will have an impact on the people that are in Cape Town, South Africa that are doing their job. It will have an impact to the people in Dubai that are doing their job. It will have an impact to the people in Sydney, Australia that are doing their job, and an impact to the people in New York City. Now, this could literally speaking take the entire network down. So as an architect, a network architect, I'm not concerned with how to configure it. I'm concerned with the following. What are the implications of this change? What does this change do to the people that are working on that organization? When I make this change, how does that affect the sales reps? Is this the right change to make? Now, if I make this change versus another change, what's its impact on the business? So learning how to be an engineer will not teach you how to be an architect. It will teach you how to be an engineer. Now, there's another problem that engineering experience actually creates in architects. Now, it gives you a better technical background. It does, but it actually creates a real technology problem. Is it changes your focus to what's in front of you versus the big picture. So if I'm an engineer and I want to write code, I got to look and be on that server, right? Or something related to it. Now, Chris, when I ask you, I'd actually like you to share my screen when I share it. So this is when you're zoomed in or focused in. Chris, can you share my screen real quick? In this particular, I am zoomed in. And what do you see? You see a squirrel in front of a tree. Now, this is really important as you see a squirrel in front of a tree. And why is that? Because when you're an engineer, that network engineer or that security engineer, you could be focused all day long on those firewalls that are in front of you. That could be your whole job is just the firewalls. Here's the real issue. Chris, you can take that screen share off. While you can right now see that squirrel, here's what you can't see that the architect is very concerned about. Everything else that's going on for that business, because you will learn how to zero in and focus as an engineer on what's in front of you because that's your job and not the big picture. Now, Chris, share this picture now because here's what was really going on in the background. See that beautiful little girl over there? That's my cat, Cindy. I love her. I adopted her, but she makes me really happy. But she was looking at that squirrel and trying to figure out how to eat the squirrel. And the more experience you have working on the firewall in front of you or the IPS system in front of you, the less you're going to be thinking about the business implications of the decisions and your impact of what you're doing on the business. You're not going to be thinking of creating ROI models, for example, and you're not going to be working with that organization to determine whether they should transfer that risk. You're not going to be building the business case. You're not going to be out there walking the hallways and testing people and seeing what they know. You're not going to be able to analyze the reports that your engineers are going to give you and the vulnerability scans that you have and try to build the plan. So learning somebody else's job doesn't get you to the gold. It doesn't. If I wanted to create a football player, the people that play soccer, football, whatever the case is, not the American football, but if I wanted to create a football player, I wouldn't put him in the pool. I wouldn't get them playing tennis. I would teach them how to play soccer or football. And then I would build the strength and conditioning routine for football players as opposed to volleyball players, baseball players. And that's why to really maximize your career, work in the career you want. Don't learn from somebody else's job because you know what it's going to make you good at? Somebody else's job. You know what it's going to make you very bad at? The job you actually want. I hope that makes sense. But we'll cover the role and exactly everything architects do on Thursday on this webinar. And you'll be surprised when you actually hear what it is. It's a pretty non-technical role. It's a really business role. And that's why architects get paid so much, because we're so close to the business.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. There's a lot of misconceptions. Just 30 seconds. There's a great misconception between people that they see other security architects and they hear their stories. And what they generally hear is that this person came from the bottom rank and they worked their way up.
Yep.
This is not necessarily a trajectory that you need to take. I always say, when somebody tells me you have to pay your dues, you have to do NOC, then you got to do SOC. I'm still trying to figure out who am I paying my dues for. If I want to be an architect, let me train to be that profession and then go for it. All the other stuff can at times, depending on, just like I told Paul, can be a distraction to you.
Yep.
That doesn't mean it has no value. That's not what we're saying.
No.
But you're going to have to take valuable time that you can make money with eventually in a security architect profession, and pivot that towards the engineering profession. And those are going to be contradictory to each other. That's why train for the career and have that objective in front of you, that goal, so that when you shoot that arrow that you can hit it, not try to go multiple streams. So just a little advice as to where that thinking comes from. Now, the next question we have, Mike, is from Roy. He's asking, he's saying, great session. Getting a certification is one thing, but getting the mentorship is another to become a good cloud architect. He says, then where would one get good mentorship for becoming one?
Well, we believe that our live cloud architect career development program is great mentorship, in that we have live classes 3 times per week. And we'll talk about this more on our webinar. And we have people in every part of the world. We have tremendous number of architects actually teaching in this webinar, and they'll answer questions via Slack to our students as well as in the live classes. So we think we have, and we've got people working at Apple and Amazon and Cisco and IBM and Google and Microsoft and Accenture, Deloitte, KPMG, Capgemini, PricewaterhouseCoopers, JP Morgan Chase Bank, Barclays Bank, CDW, Kelly, and MUFG Banks, PNC Bank, and TELUS, and many other companies from this program. So, but there's that. But it doesn't have to be me. But if it's not me, find someone that's been a distinguished architect like a David Lithicum. And he also was one of our instructors as well. But you really got to find people that have made it, that have done it. Because the biggest problem we have in architects is somebody passes a certification exam, they can't get a job. And the next thing you know, they've got a course on Udemy and they're now advising people on how to get a career that they can't get hired for on their own. And that's the biggest concern. And actually, a lot of the Udemy course providers have come to us and asked us to train them. So that's how I know by experience this is how it's done.
And I hope everybody has seen that little 15-minute warning that was put in the chat. We are going to be stopping at 5:30 p.m. today. So just keep that in mind as the questions come in, that if they keep rolling, and we might not be able to answer every single one of them. Yeah. Now, to get to the question to Aro Volo, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name. The question is, does the CCSP help to gain knowledge on the DevSecOps?
Some of it is yes. So the CCSP is everything. So DevSecOps is like this much of a career that's this wide. So the architect career is going to be, this wide, and it's not going to be very deep on anything. DevSecOps is this much of the cybersecurity thing as it relates to DevOps and coding practices, but it's going to go a lot deeper than what we're going to cover, because this is more of a planning something. So DevSecOps is one of them. And if your knowledge or love is DevSecOps, it's great. It really is. Understand that your earning potential will be 2 to 3 times higher in architecture type roles, if that's your goal. But if you love code and you love DevOps and you love being hands-on, DevSecOps is an option. Just be very careful when we're dealing with these engineering careers. Is a lot of the scripting and automation of DevSecOps can be done by AI. None of the work as an architect could be done by AI. So as you plan your career, think about the implications of what can be automated. What can't be automated is meeting with an executive, presenting at a conference, walking the hallways, learning the relationships, all these architect things. So I love engineering careers and I love engineers. I do. Just think about that in the back as you plan your career. We're about 3 to 5 years away from AI being able to write any code we actually need. I'm already using it for Python scripts, Bash shell scripts, Terraform scripts, and And that's today. And we're going to get a lot better, a lot faster.
Yep. And just to let you know, we'll have an entire section on securing the application development in the cloud. That's also going to deal with the software development cycle, and it's also going to bring in a little bit of the DevSecOps operations in regards to the CI/DI pipeline and things like that. But that's going to be later on in probably actually the second week that I'm thinking about, but we'll touch on it. Now, a question from Joanna. What level of experience do you need to participate in this training? I am a complete
No.
newbie. Okay, none. It says, like, I do have some medical, technical, and compliance experience as a mammography technologist.
Okay, so Joanne, here's the thing. I don't need you to know anything to start any of our training because I start someone at ground zero. I do need you to understand that your job as a mammography technologist gives you a strategic advantage in architecture type careers. So a nurse I trained, Camille, became an architect. I forget whether she was a cloud security architect or a cloud architect, but she got a really good role. I am a medical professional myself. What I want you to take from your medical technologist background is not the little bit of tech that you actually worked on. It's the fact that you have to learn how to communicate with patients, how to be empathetic with patients, how when a patient is scared, you need to calm them down, how when you do a mammography, if it causes breast pain for the woman, you either finish it and talk them through it, or we do an ultrasound or something different for the patient. That level of being able to talk to the person and learn about the person and not making them feel uncomfortable with an uncomfortable exam is so much that we actually have to do on the higher end skills that'll earn you a lot more money in the cybersecurity architecture type careers, or even pre-sales careers in engineering. So you can do anything you want. But I'm going to tell you, if you come from a healthcare background, they're usually the easiest people that you can put in architecture careers, salespeople and healthcare people. And it's because of what they call, when I was in school, they called it therapeutic communication, or how to talk to patients. What it really was empathetic communication. So great news. I hate to see you go leaving the healthcare world, but I also understand the amount of work we do, the low rewards and the stress we have. That's why many people, including me, move from healthcare to tech.
All right. Let's take a look at our next question. And thank you for the question, John. Really appreciate it. So this one is from Oliver. He's asking, what is the goal of this class?
So if this class you're referring to is our CCSP free bootcamp that we're running right now and not some other training program, the goal of this class is to help you pass this CCSP certification. That's exactly what we're doing. The goal of our paid training programs is to cover every aspect you need of the career, from the beginning to everything you need to do to the job, to how do you get an interview, to how do you interview, to how do you negotiate a higher salary, to what do you do on your resume and LinkedIn page. But in this particular program, which is completely free, we are preparing you for one of the most significant cybersecurity certifications that are out there, with one of the best brands and one of the best names, and it's completely free. So that's the goal of this class. And we're also trying to teach you some cloud security along the way, in as much as we can teach in 30 hours, which is a good place to start. So that's the goal here.
And something else that you want to keep in mind, Oliver, is that this gives people a good indication of what security is like, how they can implement it, and give them a good start into the career without having to spend $1,000, $2,000, or sometimes even what you see some of the courses go out there, $9,000. Not many people have that type of cash just lying around. So this gives them a good opportunity to ingest this information. And it also allows us an opportunity to give back to the community something that is not so easily gained. And that is years of experience, as well as some technical and very much of the business expertise that we carry with our training products. So a question from Paul Johnson. He's asking, what are the job prospects and financial security for security architecture careers? In particular, what career field in security architecture would be the most promising, like forecasting or forecasted job growth?
Okay, so Paul, let me kind of have you change the way you're thinking about this. So when it comes to architecture careers, and there's great opportunities for security architecture careers, when it comes to architecture careers, the closer you are to the business, the more you earn. The closer you are to the technology, the less you will learn. So what I mean by that is, if you're a security solutions architect working for a company where you're designing, presenting, and selling a security solution from that vendor, you're dealing with $150,000 to $200,000 job. Now, all of a sudden, Paul, now you have more MBA skills and more MBA knowledge, and now you're talking more about strategy. And now your job goes from $300,000 to $600,000 a year. The closer you get to the business, the more you earn. The closer you get to the tech, the less you earn. Not me. I wish it was the other way along, but for some reason, the people that see you doing business things, they pay you a lot more than if they see you doing tech things. You're not thought as the geek, you're taught as the strategist. So whatever reason, people are crazy. Sometimes when it comes to how they pay people, our engineers need more money. I love our engineers. So there's that. There is no limit to the number of opportunities you have in security. A guy like me could literally make a LinkedIn post and get 5 security architect offers in a day. And the ones in banking are absolutely incredible. And how good are these job opportunities in banking for good architects? Well, to put it into context, 1 year Goldman Sachs gave the average employee a $600,000 bonus. Average. So if you're at one of these companies and you get a $180,000, $150,000 to $180,000 base salary, expect to get a good bonus. In the banking world, it could be a few $100,000. If you're at a company like a Cisco, you could get a 35+% bonus, plus additional things, plus stock grants, plus this. It's a whole lot.
All right. Our next question is from Mohammed. He's saying, what's a good bridge to switch from technical profile to architect role, and how we can improve? And then he says, my skills to analyze customer requirements, advise them with appropriate solutions. So how do we switch from technical to architecture?
I'll tell you what I did, Mohammed, and then I'll tell you why I created this program. Here's what I did. Here's the reality. I went and got a master's in business administration, and I took approximately $100,000 of training and presentations training, sales skills training, executive presence training, emotional intelligence training, leadership training. And thankfully, my employer paid for a lot of that. But that's what it really took. It took me having a tech position and pretending to know less about the technology and more about the business, swapping out my t-shirts for suits, and then I got there. We created a program, and we've got people hired at every cloud company you can think of and every technology vendor. And whether it's Cisco or Palo Alto or Zscaler, lots of security vendors, people that I've trained are working there as architects. But the key is you can take our training, but you have to understand that you have to develop the business acumen of an MBA, regardless of whether you get it from us or in an MBA program. You have to have sales skills. You have to be able to lead large teams. You have to give presentations, whether it be at conferences, at executive briefings. And guess what the last part of your security architect interview is? A presentation in front of a panel of people. You're going to have to know how to write like an executive. Lead a team. Lead the engineers that are going to build that proof of concept to you. Quantify the business things. And when you do that, all that, you're an architect. So lots of ways to get there. 3 more questions to go through. Now I'm going to stop at these 3.
All right. So no more questions. We're doing 3 more, and that's it, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll answer a few more, and then of course Thursday we'll have the webinar. This is from Scooby Dow. It says, wondering if the product owner role is somewhat useful in this aspect of this focus as a cloud architect. Would previous experience such as Scrum Master also be valuable?
So the Scrum Master, no, has nothing to do with what we're dealing with. Now, let's say you are a product architect and not a product manager, but a product architect. And what I mean by this is you had to go out there and you built a business council of, say, C-suite executives, and you asked these C-suite executives exactly the features, functionalities, and products they're looking for in the future. And then you went out there and you got that information, and then you built a business case to senior management to go raise the necessary funding that you needed to manage your department and to staff your department. And then you are hiring people on your department and creating vendor relationships with various vendors that are going to be involved, setting up the marketing structure with internal marketing people and external marketing people, presenting your findings on a routine basis to the C-suite. If you're doing that stuff, yeah, that's going to transfer real well. But the key to remember is architecture's everything. And an architect would more be focused on all the product and portfolios that a vendor would offer as opposed to just one. We have to be careful with an architect because it's the big picture as a rule. And the product person, if they're only focusing on the features and functionalities for one device, that's not an architect. That becomes much more engineering oriented. But if you're determining everything from what to price it, what to promote it, to what the ad campaigns are, and you're managing all these vendors, then yes, this is a lot like it. Kind of hope that helps.
All right, next question, please. From Tommy. I am a network engineer and I would like to make the pivot to cloud networking, but I can't seem to find any jobs to see what the requirements are.
So I'll tell you the requirements. And there's no such thing as cloud networking. There is networking. And that's why you're not going to find it. So here's what you need to know to be a real network engineer and actually get a job. You must know BGP. And I don't mean how to configure it. I mean BGP, the way the finite state machine works, the messages that are involved, how you would tune it and performance tune it, how you would aggregate your routes, how you would summate your routes, when and where you need to use IBGP across your systems, your IP address planning, your subnet planning, and which we need some good knowledge of interior gateway protocols. Again, not the basics on how to configure, but the actual knowledge of how these underlying routing protocols actually work. You'll need to obviously understand a good knowledge of switching, whether that be things like trunking, things like VLANs, VLAN tagging, whether it be link aggregation groups and the such. You're going to need a lot of knowledge on how to work around the weaknesses of the cloud. So for an example, you can send a cloud provider 100 routes, but you may have 8,000 routes in your interior gateway protocol. So you need to understand where that. You need to be able to determine and plan and whether wide area networking technology is. So if you're a good networking engineer, you already know this. And then it's just learning the little silly cloud providers thing. So, okay, you understand how IBGP is non-transitive and where the problem comes from. If you truly understand IBGP and why it's non-transitive and how we would break those rules with, say, a route reflector, then you're going to completely understand what is a cloud hub, what is transit gateway, and any of these cloud things. Cloud networking is basically the same networking we've done for the last 30 years with less features and functionality. So Cisco had NetFlow 20 years ago. AWS has VPC flow logs now. In 1998, Cisco allowed you to run IPsec over direct connection. In 2023, guess what? AWS allowed you to run IPsec over a private line. So it's just reduced functionality. So if you've got good, strong networking engineering experience and you're going to work on the cloud, just learn the basics of the cloud because the network is the cloud. The cloud is just somebody else's network and data center. It won't be a complicated thing.
All right. I feel like we need drum rolls for this last question here.
Yeah.
And this is from Alexander. They're asking AWS or Azure? AWS Solution Associates and AWS Solution Professionals, or the AZ-104 and the AZ-305? You said the AWS ones are good, but I like Microsoft equivalent. Or does it really matter?
It's 100% meaningless which one of these things you pass. Here's the rule. So from an employer perspective, we have what we call pre-fundamental certification, fundamental certification, and professional certifications. Pre-fundamental certifications are things like an A+, Net+, Security+. You may need to start with them to get your fundamentals. You can totally skip them and go straight into what we're doing today. They're pre-fundamentals. If somebody has that, they're not really hireable from my perspective for anything other than a help desk type role. One step above that are our fundamentals. They're like our AWS Solutions Architect Associate, your Azure AZ admin thing. Again, not going to get any employer to really think about you or care that much. It's the fundamentals, like you're almost ready to do the job. Now, when it comes to the understanding, the AWS Solutions Architect Professional, the Azure Solutions Architect Expert, it depends on your career. If your goal is an architecture career, they will teach you nothing related to your career because they will teach you the name of the service and how to configure that. So you might ask why you should get one. You should get one because it's going to get you an interview, and that's great. And then you should learn how to be an architect so you can actually get hired. If your goal is engineering, by comparison, that AWS Solutions Architect Professional, Azure Solutions Architect Expert, which are much more hands-on, are going to be very valuable for that engineering role. assuming they're mixed with the right skills that an engineer would need, like Python and Linux and Terraform and Windows Systems Administration, Kubernetes, that kind of thing. Hope that helps. And it's all based upon your ultimate career goals. But
All right,
all in all, thank you so much, Nobles. So, what we'll do is I will find a time in the next 2 weeks for Mark and I to do a 2-hour Zoom question thing where we'll go over career stuff, because I want to help you regardless of whether you want to be architects, engineers, or anything. This Thursday, we're going to have a How to Get Your First Cloud Architect Job webinar, and we will go over the entire role, what we do, how we do it. Chris provided a lead to job just in. And because I know they're, and Alexander, I know they're called architect certs, but they have nothing to do with architecture. The name of a service and how to configure that has nothing to do with architecture. They should call the AWS Solution Architect Professional the AWS Admin Professional Certification. They should do the same thing for the AWS. No architecture, only engineering in them. It's kind of ridiculous. But on Thursday, we'll go over the exact role what we do as architects, and you'll see why they don't really have anything. So I'll see you on Zoom. Hope to see you on Zoom on the Thursday thing. If you haven't gotten the free ebook, our team put out a 400+ page book to help you prepare for this exam, and it's free, so go do it. And guess what? If you happen to be preparing for the CCSK or the Security Plus or the CISSP, so much of what's in that ebook is going to help you anyway, and it's free, so go get it. I've enjoyed spending the day with you. Can you give me a hashtag CCSP so that I know you're awake, alert, and oriented? If you haven't liked the video, please give it a like. If you are not a subscriber to our channel, please subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new videos to help you in your career. And for fun, check out the description of some of our videos. You'll find free interview guides, free ebooks on how to become an architect, the skills of an architect, and they're all free. So go get them.
Yeah.
Mark, do you have any last closing words for the day?
I do. And I want to say, remember, everybody, tomorrow we're going on to day 2. So be sure you tune into the same, I was going to say Bat channel, but I hope we don't get no copyright strike for that. But, anybody who has seen the original 1960s Batman gets it. Anyway, we hope to see everybody tomorrow for day number 2. If you enjoyed day number 1, you'll definitely continue to enjoy the next 9 days that we have prepared for you. And my closing remark is, I hope you all have a wonderful day, evening, or morning, wherever you might be at, and we'll all see you tomorrow.